They stood amidst the red dawn in the mountains of Dorne, the sky tinted by the rising sun's pale crimson as it crept over rocky crags. 8 men in the livery of House Stark bore grim expressions, while 3 knights in the white cloaks of the Kingsguard stood proud in front of the entrance to the Tower of Joy. The brisk wind carried the tang of dust and distant sea salt, weaving through the lonely stones. Each man present knew that blood would be spilled before that sun climbed much further across the sky. Ser Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, wore a calm resolve on his face. Next to him stood Ser Oswell Went and Lord Commander Gerald Hightower. All had swords drawn, all prepared to defend what they believed was their sacred duty. The defense of Prince Rhaegar's last hope, the defense of the secret that dwelled in the tower behind them. The men who approached were led by Eddard Stark, newly minted Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, come on a mission that brought no joy. With him were men loyal to the North, Howland Reed of the Crannigs, Ethan Glover, Martin Castle, Theo Wool, and the rest of their small band. Some were veterans of the war that had raged across the 7 kingdoms. They all carried the mark of loss in their hearts, loss that had pushed them to this small, hidden corner of the realm, far from prying eyes. Eddard's hand hovered near the hilt of his long sword, eyes flickering across the 3 Kingsguard. He had known Ser Arthur a little at King's Landing, and the reputation of the man was second to none. With Dawn strapped to his side, a sword as pale as milk glass that shimmered with its own faint glow, Ser Arthur seemed no mortal, but a legend out of the old songs. Ned felt a chill slide down his spine despite the heat of Dorne's rising sun. In the hush, Ned spoke, voice edged with heartbreak. "Why did you not join your prince on the Trident?" The question lingered in the air. Ser Arthur Dayne's eyes, gray and solemn, flickered with something akin to sorrow, but he held his silence. Gerald Hightower answered, "We serve the king, and we serve the realm." His words gave nothing away, but the tension in his stance betrayed the truth. The knights behind him guarded a precious secret within the tower. High above, Ned glimpsed a small window. Rumors had whispered that his sister, Lyanna Stark, lay within these walls. Each breath reminded him of her cries, her disappearance, the war that had been sparked by Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. And now, after all the bloodshed, Robert Baratheon stood victorious. But Ned's purpose here was not for Robert. He had come for his sister. Gerald Hightower drew his sword and advanced. His fellow Kingsguard, Ser Oswell Went, followed with a silent, lethal step. Ser Arthur Dayne slowly shifted his stance, focusing on the foes ahead. There were no further words to exchange. The clash began with a fury that startled the gulls perched on the high crags overhead. Steel sang as Arthur Dayne's dawn met Martin Castle's blade. Light flared along Dayne's sword, an otherworldly gleam that outshone the glint of the rising sun. Castle managed a single parry before he fell to Dayne's skillful slash. Gerald Hightower, older than Dayne but no less fierce, engaged Eddard Stark directly. Their swords met in a shriek of metal. Eddard fought with the practiced grace of a man tested in the fires of the rebellion. The great John had once said no man could best Ned Stark in a fair fight unless they were of rare skill. But Hightower's cunning and experience threatened Ned at every turn. The older man attacked with precision, each blow deflected at the last possible moment by Ned's longsword. Oswell Went dueled Howland Reed and Ethan Glover. The pair of Northmen circled him, searching for an opening, whence fluid footwork helped him keep them at bay. The clang and ring of steel echoed against the gray stones, stirring dust from the tower walls. Meanwhile, Theo Wool and the others attempted to isolate Ser Arthur Dayne. But Dayne fought like a whirlwind with dawn in hand, each slash, parry, and thrust as swift and sure as the next. Blood darkened the ground. 2 more of Ned's men fell to Dayne before he spun to intercept another assault. Ned could only spare a glance, but what he saw chilled him. Arthur Dayne was unstoppable, as if guided by a rhythm no other man could hear. Even the fearsome knights of the Vale or the mightiest swords of the North would have hesitated to face him one-on-one. Dawn cut the air with terrifying grace, taking yet another life from Ned's group. Eddard's face tightened in grief and grim determination. He had come so far. He refused to fail. With a fierce cry, He stepped in to break Hightower's guard, their blades clashing so violently that sparks flew. But Hightower was resolute. He forced Ned back, pushing him into a precarious stance. For one moment, Ned's heel slipped on a loose rock, and he tasted the bitter possibility of defeat. If he fell, if this last stand in the Dornish mountains ended here, then his sister would never be freed. Everything would be lost. The vow he had given to his dying father, the vow to protect Lyanna, the vow to bring her home. Hightower pressed forward, sensing weakness, but in that instant, Howland Reed, breathing heavily from his engagement with Went, struck from behind. He thrust his sword into Hightower's back, through a chink in the armor. Hightower stumbled, blood pouring from his lips. Ned, regaining his balance, instinctively lashed out with his long sword. He caught the Kingsguard in the chest. Lord Commander Gerald Hightower crumpled to the earth, his white cloak stained a deep red. Ned had no time to see if Hightower was dead. The fight raged on. The entire world had shrunk to the clang of steel and the gasping breath of men locked in mortal combat. Oswell Went died moments later, falling to Ethan Glover's blade. Another of Ned's men was cut down by Arthur Dayne, whose armor and cloak were now spattered with the lifeblood of foes. Only Eddard Stark and Howland Reed remained of the northern party, the rest lying wounded or dead around them. Arthur Dayne paused, chest heaving. For a heartbeat, there was a terrible hush, a moment of clarity in the midst of chaos. Dust motes drifted in the dawn light. In that sliver of silence, Ned could hear the distant cry of a woman echoing from the tower. His sister's voice, a plea or a warning. It was all the impetus Ned needed. He raised his sword again, preparing to face Ser Arthur. Only a second passed, but in that second, Ned knew the man before him. Noble, honorable, a knight of rare caliber who was sworn to protect. They circled each other, two weary warriors with everything on the line. Ned made the first move, cutting in with a slash. Arthur parried. The force jolted Ned's arm. Dayne twisted, feinting high then slicing low with frightening grace. Ned managed to block, but stumbled. He was no match for the Sword of the Morning in single combat, and he knew it. Dayne pressed him, landing a shallow cut along Ned's left arm. Blood seeped into the frayed cloth of Ned's sleeve. Pain sparked in Ned's mind, but fear for Lyanna drove him onward. He lunged, overextending in desperation. Dawn batted his strike aside, and Arthur Dayne turned the lethal blade toward Ned's exposed chest. Howland Reed, battered and bleeding, threw himself forward. His small shield crashed against Dayne's side. It was not enough to wound the Sword of the Morning, but it was enough to shift the angle of his blow. Instead of running Ned through, Dayne's blade sliced the air near Ned's shoulder. Ned fell to one knee, sword clattering onto the stones. Dayne spun to fend off Howland with a slash that knocked the Crannogman backward onto the ground. Howland lost his shield as he rolled to avoid a killing thrust. From the corner of his eye, Ned saw Dayne raise Dawn for a final blow. But something, perhaps a shred of mercy or a pang of conscience, stalled him for half a heartbeat. He took a single breath, and in that breath, Eddard Stark had time to scramble forward. He grabbed his sword and rammed it upward, toward Arthur's midsection. The blow was not clean. Dayne's reflexes were superhuman. He twisted aside, preventing a fatal strike. Nonetheless, Ned's blade cut deep into Arthur's side. The knight gasped, eyes wide. Dawn clattered from his grip, the pale blade ringing eerily against the stones. For a moment the world ceased to turn. Ser Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, staggered with a wound that oozed dark red. There was shock in his gaze, and Ned saw an echo of sadness, perhaps regret. Then the knight collapsed onto his knees, blood soaking his armor. Ned, panting in the thin Dornish air, rose unsteadily. Howland knelt beside Arthur, uncertain of whether to finish the deed. Eddard drew close, sword trembling in his hand as he debated the killing stroke. Yet the memory of Arthur's mercy, the knowledge of the man's honor, stayed his blade. This was Arthur Dayne, famed for his chivalry, for his loyalty, for being the finest knight in the realm. Did he deserve to die on these broken stones under the hush of the desert wind? He bled profusely, though he still breathed. Dawn lay at his side, the milky blade unbloodied, almost luminous despite the gloom. Eddard thought of everything. The vow he had made to Lyanna, the terrible secret that must lie in the tower, the war that had ended with Rhaegar's downfall. The realm was all but in Robert's hands now. The Targaryen cause was lost. Yet in Arthur's eyes, Ned saw no hatred, no savage desire for vengeance. Instead, he saw acceptance. He saw a man who had devoted himself to a cause he believed right. "Spare him," came Howland's voice, breathless, interrupting Ned's silent struggle. "He has fought with honor. We can learn why they guarded this place. We can." Ned looked from the Crannogman's weary face to Dayne's ashen features. If he left Arthur here, the night would die. If he ended Arthur's life, he would never have to worry about the man's oath or retribution. But if he spared him, if he trusted in the man's honor, perhaps something greater than any had foreseen might happen. Eddard hesitated only a moment longer. Then he murmured, "We will tend to him." He knelt and pressed a hand to Arthur's wound, attempting to staunch the flow of blood with a scrap of cloth from his own cloak. Arthur's eyes flickered open, and Ned glimpsed a faint astonishment there, perhaps gratitude. The remaining men did what they could. Howland, with his knowledge of herbs from the Crannogs, began to treat the wound with trembling hands. They bandaged Arthur's side as best as possible under the circumstances. Then Ned rose and sprinted into the tower, propelled by fear and hope. He found Lyanna in the upper chamber, her sheets drenched in blood and sweat, her once lively face pallid, breath coming in shaky gasps. She was delirious, eyes flicking up as Ned approached, tears slipping free. He gently took her hand, horror seizing him at the sight of her. Cries rang out in the small room. There was the mewling of a newborn, swaddled on a makeshift cradle of old blankets. Ned's heart pounded. He saw the truth in his sister's eyes even before she spoke. He recognized the black hair, the shape of the babe's face. She begged Ned for promises. "Keep him safe. Don't let him be taken. Promise me." Ned, tears streaming, promised everything. Lyanna Stark's final breath came a moment later. Sobs tore from him. He held his sister's limp hand, the baby's wailing echoing in the chamber like a morning dirge. Outside, the dawn had fully broken over the mountains, but Ned's world had descended into darkness. Exhausted, devastated, he took the child into his arms. He vowed then and there to protect him. This was Rhaegar's son, Ned had no doubt. A Targaryen child in a world where Robert Baratheon was crowned victor. A child who would be executed if discovered. Slowly, Ned carried the babe out. Howland Reed hovered on the steps, anxious to discover whether Lyanna was alive. His expression crumpled when Ned shook his head. The Lord of Winterfell then glanced at Arthur Dayne, who lay on his side in a pool of drying blood. He was alive, still breathing faintly, though the color had drained from his cheeks. Ned approached him with the child in his arms. In a voice cracked with emotion, Ned said quietly, "My sister is dead. She has left a son. You and your brothers were here to protect him, were you not?" Arthur's gaze dropped to the infant. Slowly, painfully, he nodded. "He is the prince's son," he rasped. "His name is Aegon." A cough rattled in his throat, flecking his lips with crimson. We swore to keep him safe." Ned's eyes flicked to the dead bodies scattered around them. "And you did," he said, voice hollow. "I have promised to protect him now." Arthur exhaled a trembling breath. "Then you must do so. Swear it, Eddard Stark." Dayne's eyes were fierce with conviction despite the mortal wound. "Swear to me. If you spare me, I will not rest until I help you keep him safe. I will be his sword in the darkness, if you will have me." Ned stared at him, stunned by the offer. The boy in Ned's arms mewled, tiny fists curled, ignorant of the devastation around him. Ned wanted to despise all Targaryens for the suffering they had caused his family. But this was Lyanna's baby too, And not all Targaryens were Ares, not all were mad. The babe was innocent, and Arthur Dayne, an anointed knight of legendary honor, offered his sword in service to protect the child. Ned felt the gravity of that vow. For a moment, he wrestled with the memory of Brandon, of Rickard, of the horrors that befell House Stark at Ares's hands. Then he looked to the child again and relented, the fierce love he felt for his sister's memory overshadowing the thirst for vengeance. "I swear it," Ned whispered, eyes burning. "We shall protect him. I will keep him safe. And if you serve me in this, Arthur Dayne, then I will spare your life." Arthur's eyes closed, a single tear slipping free. "Then I am yours." Another coughing fit rocked him. "Please, let me live to guard him. For the sake of Rhaegar's son. For the sake of the realm." From that moment on, it was decided. There was no telling how he might hide Arthur Dayne from Robert's wrath. But Ned's path was clear. With Howland's help, they bound the wounded knight's torso, staunching the blood flow. The process was agonizing. Arthur bit back groans, sweat beading on his brow. When they had done all they could, they lifted him. A horse was prepared. They placed the still bleeding Dayne across the saddle. Howland volunteered to guide the horse while Ned carried the infant. The handful of men from the north who had survived would return to Winterfell. Howland had lost many friends here, just as Ned had, and their hearts were heavy with grief. Yet they resolved to fulfill Ned's vow, for the sake of the child. As they rode from the Tower of Joy, Ned cast one last look at the lonely structure. The wind whistled through the doorway, and the shining sun of Dorne lit the stones in a stark glow, reminding him of how fleeting all of this was. Lyanna was gone, but part of her lived on in this boy, his tiny face pressed against Ned's chest. Ned silently pledged that he would protect the child from Robert Baratheon's hatred, from all those who would see the boy's blood spilt to secure the new reign. Whether he liked it or not, Ned had a Targaryen in his arms. But the boy would be raised as something else, a Stark, or at least under Stark protection. The journey north from Dorne was long and arduous. Arthur Dayne hovered between life and death for much of it. In the night, when they made camp, Ned would feed the baby and then check on Dayne's bandages. The knight drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time he woke, he asked after the child. He repeated the name Aegon, but Ned always looked away or pretended not to hear. He had yet to decide what to call the boy when they reached Winterfell, or how exactly he would spin the tale of the child's parentage to the realm. Word had already spread that Robert Baratheon had taken the Iron Throne. The war was over and the Targaryen king was dead. By the time Ned's party approached the Riverlands, ravaged farmland and blackened ruins spoke of the toll the fighting had taken. They tried to avoid large gatherings, suspicious lords, or roving soldiers. Ned's primary concern was Arthur's survival and ensuring the boy remained undiscovered. Several times they nearly crossed paths with armed men loyal to the new King Robert, but Howland's cunning and knowledge of hidden ways helped them slip by unnoticed. At night, Ned often found himself restless, gazing at the infant whose dark hair and stormy gray eyes, just beginning to focus, were a testament to both parents. He was Rhaegar's son, but also Lyanna's. Ned felt torn between the realm's hatred for all Targaryens and the paternal protectiveness stirring inside him for the child. At last, they arrived at the neck, where the land narrowed and the bogs and marshes of Howland's people began. By then, Arthur was able to sit upright without fainting. He was pale, weaker than Ned had ever thought possible for such a fabled warrior, yet still determined to see the boy safe. In a quiet glade where they paused, Ned took a measured risk and spoke plainly with the sword of the morning. He told him, softly, that the child must never be known as Rhaegar's son if he was to live. Arthur listened, pain etched in every line of his face, eyes hollow from fever. He spoke in a strained whisper. "Then, how shall we keep him? We cannot hide who he is forever." Ned's voice was thick. "We can try. For the boy's sake, we must. Robert will kill him otherwise." Ned's eyes drifted to the infant, squirming in a makeshift cradle. "I will claim him. I will say he is my bastard." Arthur did not flinch at the blunt statement. though a sorrowful expression weighed down his features. "Your sister deserved better than that. The boy is a prince by blood. You would make him a bastard." Ned shook his head sadly. "He will not be a bastard in my heart, but to the world it must appear so. This is the only way to keep him safe under my protection without arousing suspicion." Arthur stared at the ground, troubled. "So be it. I will keep silent about his parentage. But let me stand watch over him, quietly, from the shadows. As I swore, if you would have me, let me guard him at Winterfell. Let me teach him how to wield a sword, how to be honorable and just." Ned hesitated. The idea of Arthur Dayne living at Winterfell was fraught with danger. If word reached King Robert, or if any suspicious lords or ladies recognized the Sword of the Morning, it could spark questions with answers too dangerous to contemplate. But the alternative was to turn Arthur out or kill him, and Ned found he could not kill a man for being faithful to vows that had led him to protect Ned's nephew. "It would mean forging a new identity," Ned said quietly. "You cannot openly be Sir Arthur Dayne anymore. For the child's sake, and your own, you must become someone else. To Catelyn. If the realm discovered you, it would not end well. We could say you died at the Tower of Joy. That is what I intend to tell Robert." Arthur exhaled shakily. "I understand. I will be a dead man to the world. But I will live for the boy, to keep him safe." He coughed, pressing a hand to the bandage at his side. "I am your man now, Ned Stark." Despite the swirl of conflicting emotions, Ned extended a hand. Arthur clasped it, wincing at the strain. Ned suspected that Dayne's wound would leave a permanent weakness, perhaps even hamper his once peerless swordsmanship. But the man's spirit burned bright. Ned wondered if that indomitable spark was what had once made Dayne the realm's greatest knight. Perhaps it would guide them both down the treacherous road ahead. They passed through Moat Cailin and traversed the north's expanse until the towers of Winterfell appeared. That first glimpse of home stirred countless memories for Ned, especially of the family he had lost. His father, his brother, and now Lyanna. He tightened his hold on the baby, breathing in the cold northern air. This was his land. He was Lord of Winterfell now, with new responsibilities. The weight was immense. In the courtyard, servants and guards gathered to greet their returning lord. They gaped at the battered, diminished company. The rumors had traveled quickly. That Ned Stark had fought at the Tower of Joy, that the Kingsguard were slain, that Ned had lost many good men. Catelyn Tully stood on the steps with uncertainty shading her blue eyes. She rushed forward as Ned dismounted, a question forming on her lips. Then she spotted the babe cradled in her husband's arms. Her face fell with shock and confusion. "What is this, my lord?" she asked. Her tone was gentle, but there was an edge of alarm. Ned's jaw tensed. He had prepared himself for this moment, but it still felt like a betrayal to lie to his wife. "He is mine," Ned forced out, each word like swallowing glass. "His name is Jon Snow." The name came to him suddenly, a melding of old tradition that the North used for bastards, and perhaps an echo of Jon Arryn, the man who had fostered Ned and Robert. A man of honor, if ever there was one. Catelyn paled. She looked as though she'd been struck. A bastard child? Her voice quivered, and she couldn't bring herself to look at the baby. Ned nodded once, unable to meet her gaze directly. "Yes, born during the war. I will raise him as is my duty." It was the rehearsed line, but shame twisted in his gut. She deserved the truth, yet he could not tell her. A babe's life was on the line. He could never place that burden on her. Arthur Dayne, disguised in simple northern garb, waited off to the side, looking pale and uneasy. No one recognized him as the legendary Sword of the Morning. His hair had grown longer, and the fever had stolen the healthy glow from his face, thinning him. He had shaved his short, distinguished beard, and the color in his cheeks had yet to return. In that moment, he looked like a downtrodden Sellsword, silent and unobtrusive. Ned had made him vow never to call attention to himself, never to speak of his station. He would serve as a guard, an unremarkable retainer in Ned's service. His presence drew curious eyes, but none guessed his identity. That night, as Ned tried to rest in his chambers, Catelyn sought him. He could see the hurt in her face, the confusion. She did not rail at him in anger, nor did she demand the child be cast out. Catelyn Tully was raised to be a lady, but her disappointment and sorrow were palpable. "I do not understand," she whispered, voice trembling. "Who is the mother? Did you love her? How could you do this?" Ned gently held her hands. "I'm sorry," he murmured and said no more. His eyes brimmed with guilt, but also with the knowledge that telling her the truth could endanger everything. She looked away, tears gathering, and left him alone with that guilt. Ned stared at the dying embers in the hearth. The wind whistled outside, carrying the promise of a cold night. He would carry this burden for as long as it took. Jon's life was worth the sacrifice. In the weeks that followed, the household adjusted, some more willingly than others, to the presence of the new babe, Jon Snow. Whispers filled corridors and corners about the identity of the mother, about the scandal that a fathered bastard posed to House Stark. But Ned Stark, stern and honorable, put a swift end to any open gossip. Jon was his responsibility, and no matter how cold Catelyn's glances became, Ned remained steadfast. Arthur Dayne took on the name Arlen, a mere sellsword who had pledged his blade to the Stark cause. His presence in Winterfell was explained as a man indebted to Ned for saving him from outlaws in the south. No one looked too closely. The north was vast, and sellswords from the war drifted in all the time. Ned gave Arlen modest quarters in a far-off corner of the keep, not wanting to rouse suspicion by placing him too near. Day by day, Dayne's health improved. He walked the courtyards, oversaw some of the guards' sword drills, and occasionally sparred with the more experienced men. As weeks turned into months, rumors circulated that this Arlen was no ordinary swordsman. He possessed uncanny skill, but few could dream that he was the sword of the morning in disguise. Most nights, when all was quiet and the moon hung over the battlements, Arthur would visit the small cradle where baby Jon slept. He rarely spoke, but he would stare down at the sleeping child, face a mixture of tenderness and sorrow. Sometimes Ned joined him. They exchanged few words, but a bond grew between them, forged in secrecy, in the vow to protect a boy who might be killed for his birth. Winterfell's routine soon enveloped the child and the hidden night. Seasons shifted. Robert Baratheon was crowned in King's Landing. Tywin Lannister maintained his position as the realm's wealthiest lord, and other high lords bent the knee. Ned refused the king's commands to come south for a time, claiming pressing matters in the north, thus deflecting any potential suspicion about the boy's real identity. Letters arrived from the capital, sometimes from Robert himself, who congratulated Ned on surviving the war and establishing his hold on the north. In those letters, Robert often boasted about his new position or asked about the rest of the Starks, but Ned noticed that Robert never once asked about bastards or rumored children. Perhaps the new king had heard the gossip but deemed it unimportant. Ned's personal affair was no threat to Robert's reign so long as no Targaryen blood was involved. The next few years brought change and growth. Ned and Catelyn's first trueborn child, Robb Stark, was born, and soon after came Sansa, then Arya. All the while, Jon Snow grew, always a step out of place, always aware on some instinctive level that he was not quite the same as his half-siblings. Catelyn tolerated him with distant politeness at best, icy disdain at worst. The rest of Winterfell's staff treated Jon as best they could, though many followed the lady's lead. In the practice yard, the steward's boy or the master-at-arms might let slip a comment. "He's only a bastard." Still, Jon persevered with a quiet resilience that Ned recognized as part of his Stark heritage, and perhaps something more. Arthur Dayne, still living as Arlen, remained close. He volunteered to train the pages and squires in the art of swordsmanship. Ser Roderick Castle, the master-at-arms, welcomed the assistants. Arlen seemed to have an uncanny eye for detail, pointing out footwork errors and posture flaws that few others noticed. Over time, Ser Roderick came to respect him, though he occasionally wondered at the Sellsword's near-nightly discipline. As Jon Snow grew from a toddling child into a boy of 5, Arlen took special notice of him. There was a warmth in his gaze whenever Jon passed by, a subtle sense of guardianship. Though no one officially declared him as Jon's caretaker, he was always present in the background. Ned watched it happen, mindful of the vow they had both sworn. He never forbade Dayne from guiding Jon, but neither did he openly encourage it. The secret had to remain, and so Arthur Dayne became the hidden sentinel in Jon's life, offering the boy small lessons: how to hold a practice sword, how to move one's feet, encouraging Jon when the other children, especially some lords' wards, teased him about his bastard name. At first, Jon was shy around Arlen, uncertain of the man's gentle presence, but in time he opened up. He found that Arlen spoke to him not like a lesser, but with genuine respect. When the older squires laughed at Jon's attempts with a wooden sword, Arlen would patiently correct his stance, praising him for progress, no matter how small. Jon felt a quiet gratitude for this mysterious Sellsword. When Jon turned 8, Ned decided it was time to teach the boy some Stark duties. They would ride out into the Wolfswood for a hunting trip, accompanied by Robb, Theon Greyjoy, who had arrived as a ward, and some household guards, along with Arlen to ensure their safety. By then, Theon sometimes poked fun at Jon for being a bastard, but he was no more cruel than a boy might be. Robb, for his part, treated Jon as a brother, for they had grown up side by side. Even so, there was an invisible wall. Robb was the heir, while Jon was the unwanted boy. During the hunt, Jon strove to prove himself worthy. He shot arrow after arrow at small game, showing surprising skill for his age. Robb cheered him on, but Theon teased him. Arlen said nothing, only watched with a small smile. At dusk they camped. The forest around them rustled with hidden life, and the thick canopy muted the twilight. After they finished a simple meal, the guards shared stories. Jon sat quietly, listening, but eventually he moved to the outskirts of the firelight, gazing at the moon above. His mind wandered to questions he dared not voice. Questions about his mother, about why Lady Catelyn looked at him with such coldness, about why his father seldom spoke of his birth. Arlen approached him quietly, settling on a fallen log. The crickets chirped in the undergrowth. "You did well today," Arlen offered. "Your arrow was true on that hare." Jon shrugged. "Not as true as Robb's. He hunts more often. And Theon says I'm lucky if I don't shoot myself in the foot." Arlen gave a subtle snort of amusement. "Theon is quick-tongued, but you have a steady hand. That is more important. Are you enjoying yourself, Jon?" A thoughtful pause. "Yes, though I wonder if my Lord Father brought me out here to test me." Arlen tilted his head. "Why would you think that?" Jon's young eyes flickered with uncertainty. He wants me to learn what's expected of a Stark of Winterfell. But I'm not a Stark, am I? Not truly. I'm a Snow." Arlen's chest tightened, memories of Rhaegar and Lyanna flooding him. He forced a gentle tone. "Blood can be complicated, Jon. Sometimes it is not about names, but about the honor in one's heart. Lord Stark sees something in you." Jon peered at Arlen, searching the older man's face. "Ser Rodrik says you fought in the war. Did you know my father then?" The question made Arlen's heart skip. He nodded slowly, carefully framing his words to avoid revealing the truth. I fought in the south. I owed your father a great debt for saving my life. I pledged to serve him." Jon absorbed the answer in silence, then ventured, "You're not a knight, but you fight better than any knight I've seen. Sometimes I wonder if you're from the stories, like the Sword of the Morning." Arlen's breath caught. The child's curiosity was razor-sharp, yet he had to keep the secret. He gave a soft chuckle. "I'm not from the songs, Jon. Just a man who's had good teachers. You'll surpass me someday, if you keep practicing." Jon smiled tentatively, pride glimmering in his eyes. "Maybe." He looked away, expression shifting to a quiet longing. "Arlen, do you know who my mother was?" Arthur hesitated. The question was inevitable, but he had never prepared an answer. He shook his head gently. "That is for your lord father to share if he chooses," he answered with as much kindness as he could. Jon sighed, shoulders drooping a little. "No one will tell me, not even father. I wish I knew something about her." Arthur's mind flashed to Lyanna. Her fierce spirit, her laughter, her bravery. He wanted to say all the good things about her, to let Jon know that his mother was more than a random woman. But such a confession would be catastrophic. Instead, he quietly placed a hand on Jon's shoulder. "Sometimes, the greatest mysteries in our lives are hidden to keep us safe. Believe that your father has his reasons, Jon. And know that you have people here who care about you." Jon nodded, blinking away tears he refused to shed in front of Arlen. After a moment, he straightened, as though remembering his pride. He said nothing else, and Arlen simply sat with him under the stars, silent but present, a reassuring figure in the gloom. When they returned to Winterfell, Ned noticed how quietly comfortable Jon seemed with Arlen. Ned realized he had never witnessed such a connection between Jon and any other retainer. A pang of remorse touched him. It was only natural that the child should gravitate toward the one man who knew his true parentage, though Jon himself did not know that, of course. Ned reminded himself that this arrangement was for the best. Jon needed protection. Arthur needed to fulfill his vow. Let them be close so long as no one else grew suspicious. As years passed, Jon became more adept with a sword, thanks to both Ser Roderick and Arlen's guidance. He was a quick study, fierce and determined, with a certain fluidity in his movements that belied his northern upbringing, perhaps the blood of House Dayne or House Targaryen, or the wolf's blood from Lyanna. No one could say for sure. At 10 and 2, Jon was slender, with gray eyes that had a depth beyond his years, and the same dark hair that Ned's father once had, though it curled slightly at the ends like his mother's. Robb, close in age, had a more direct, open personality, quick to laughter, quick to lead. They became an inseparable pair despite the tension that occasionally flared between them. Even Theon softened toward Jon over time, though he never let Jon forget the snow in his name. Then winter loomed. The days shortened, and the winds grew cold even before the snows truly began. Messages arrived from King's Landing that Robert was planning a grand feast, or that the realm faced new turmoil, but so far the north remained peaceful. Ned busied himself with administering justice across his lands. He would bring Robb and Jon along to witness what it meant to be a lord. Sometimes Sansa or Arya trailed along, curious as they were, but it was mostly the boys who joined him. Jon often stood at the edge of the audience chamber, gaze solemn as Ned passed judgment on poachers or resolved disputes. Arlen remained unobtrusive, occasionally standing guard near the door, his hand resting on the pommel of a plain long sword. Of all Ned's children and wards, Arya was the one who seemed to warm to Jon the most. She was a wild child, rough around the edges, forever scolded by Septa Dayne for not acting like a proper lady. She and Jon shared an unspoken understanding of feeling out of place. Arya would run to Jon, brandishing a stick and claiming it was Needle, ready to duel him. Jon humored her and taught her the basics of footwork, how to thrust with speed. Arlen watched with a bemused smile from a distance. He saw the spark of Lyanna in the girl, her fierce desire and tomboy nature. During one such lesson in a quiet corner of the courtyard, Arya swung the stick and missed, nearly tumbling forward. Jon reached out to steady her, a grin on his face. "Maybe not so wide with your swing," he said. "You leave yourself open." Arya huffed. "But it feels better. I want to cut my enemies in half." "That might work if you're as strong as the mountain," Jon teased. "But you have to be quick. If you telegraph your swings, they'll sidestep." She glowered, but she accepted his advice. From across the yard, Arlen nodded approval. Jon caught the movement and felt a flush of pride that Arlen had seen him give good instruction. For reasons Jon could not explain, he always strove for Arlen's respect, perhaps because he sensed something deeply honorable in the man. That evening, as Ned and Catelyn dined in the great hall with their children, Jon slipped away after finishing his meal. Arlen found him outside, near the stables, gazing at the stars. Night had settled over Winterfell, and torches glowed along the walls. Snow had begun to drift, laying a soft dusting on the courtyard. "There you are," Arlen said softly. "You're not cold." Jon shook his head, exhaling a puff of steam. "I like it out here. It's quiet." Arlen stepped closer, his breath also misting in the frigid air. "You did well today with Lady Arya." Jon smiled faintly. "She's stubborn, but she learns quick." He hesitated, then looked at Arlen. "I wanted to ask, will you spar with me? Truly spar? Ser Roderick says I'm almost old enough to try steel instead of just wooden swords." Arlen studied the boy. He saw the bright spark in Jon's eyes, the eagerness, the yearning, so reminiscent of the Targaryen princes he had once known. If times had been different, perhaps Jon would have been a squire to a famous knight, recognized for the blood of kings in his veins. Arthur suppressed the ache in his chest and nodded. "Very well. Not tonight, though. Tomorrow at dawn. Meet me in the smaller courtyard." Jon's eyes lit up. "Yes, Arlen. Thank you." That next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Jon stood waiting in the lesser courtyard, stamping his feet to fight the chill. Arlen arrived with 2 practice swords made of steel but blunted edges. Wordlessly, he handed one to Jon and took his stance. Jon's breath fogged. An icy wind curled around the towers. In the dim light, Arlen's face looked carved from stone, his eyes sharp. Jon swallowed, a thrill of anticipation lighting his nerves. "Ready yourself," Arlen said simply. Jon lifted his sword. Their first clash resounded in the cold air. Even with the blunted blade, Arlen's blows carried speed and skill beyond anything Jon had faced. Jon struggled to keep his guard. He tried to recall all that Arlen and Ser Roderick had taught him, but the older man's footwork was near flawless, and his strikes came from unexpected angles. Jon found himself on the defensive almost immediately. They danced across the courtyard, boots scuffling on the frosted ground. Arlen struck low. Jon barely parried in time. He responded with a thrust, but Arlen sidestepped with ease, pivoting to slash lightly at Jon's ribs. The boy hissed, stumbling back. It was a light hit, more a tap than a blow, but it stung. Jon regained his stance, ignoring the sting of cold in his lungs. "Focus," Arlen admonished quietly. "Watch my hips, not the blade." Jon nodded, lips pressed tight. He tried again, feinting a slash, stepping inside Arlen's guard. For a heartbeat, it seemed he might land a hit. But Arlen turned with fluid grace, guiding Jon's blade aside. Another light rap on Jon's shoulder. A surge of frustration burned in Jon's chest. He was trying so hard, yet it seemed effortless for Arlen to counter him. He pressed forward again, swinging from the left. Arlen blocked high, but Jon reversed mid-swing, aiming lower. A flicker of approval crossed Arlen's face, but once more, the older man managed to pivot. This time, Jon's foot slipped on the icy ground, and he toppled, landing on his side with a grunt, the steel-practiced sword clanging beside him. He panted, cheeks burning with cold and humiliation. Arlen lowered his own blade, offering a hand. "Again," he said, "you are improving, but you're letting your frustration rule you." Jon accepted the hand and stood. Tiny bits of frost clung to his cloak. It feels like no mat." Arlen gave him a rare, gentle smile. "I am older, more experienced. But you have potential, Jon. That is clear. Do not be discouraged by defeat. Each defeat teaches you something new." Jon nodded, swallowing hard. They resumed their positions. Blow after blow, parry after parry, Arlen guided him, offering soft critiques. Gradually, Jon's movements smoothed, his footwork steadied. He managed a few respectable counters, even forcing Arlen to move quickly to avoid being tagged once. When they finished, both were breathing hard, pale clouds escaping their mouths. Jon's muscles ached, but a glowing sense of accomplishment filled him. He could feel himself improving under Arlen's watchful eye. They continued these dawn lessons for months, hidden from the rest of Winterfell. Sometimes the direwolf pups, found by the Stark children a year past in this altered timeline, watched from the edges. Jon's albino direwolf, Ghost, quietly observed with red eyes, silent as a shade. Arlen found it uncanny how the wolf never made a sound, just as he found Jon's dedication unwavering. This was how the boy grew strong. And so the years rolled on. The cycle of the seasons in the north shaped their days, from crisp autumn hunts to the deep snows of winter. Ned guided his family through feast days and quiet nights. Each day, Jon grew taller, stronger, his hair slightly curly at the ends, his eyes thoughtful. Robb learned the duties of a future lord, while Sansa blossomed into a lady, Arya forever the rebel. Bran was born, then Rickon. Winterfell was full of life and promise. Arthur Dayne remained in the shadows as Arlen. He never forgot his vow. Secretly, he marveled at the boy's progress. Whenever he saw glimpses of Rhaegar in Jon's reflective silences or Lyanna in Jon's fierce loyalty, a swirl of mixed emotions stirred in him. He suppressed any longing for Starfall, his ancestral home, for his sister Ashera, for the life he once knew. The only tie he maintained to that old life was Dawn, kept hidden in a trunk deep in the bowels of Winterfell, sealed away at Ned's instruction. Its pale blade had once stood for House Dayne's greatest honor, but for now, it must remain concealed. Arthur often dreamed of it at night. In some dreams, he was crowned in white armor again, bearing Dawn into battle. In others, he was kneeling in the Tower of Joy's dust, blood seeping from his side. He always awoke with a sense of loss, only to remember he had a new purpose: protect Jon Snow. On Jon's 14th name day, Ned allowed him to participate in a tourney near White Harbor, a small event in celebration of Lord Manderly's heir coming of age. Robb would ride in the squire's joust. Jon would try his skill in the melee. Arlen accompanied them, mostly unnoticed, just another guard in House Stark's retinue. When the melee began, Jon squared off against other boys near his age. He moved with cautious precision, employing techniques gleaned from Dawn lessons. He fended off a big lad from House Serwyn, disarming him with a clever feint. The small crowd cheered. Ultimately, Jon did not win the melee. He was knocked down by a more experienced boy from House Manderly. But his skill drew attention, and more than one observer noted that the bastard of Winterfell fought with the grace of a well-trained squire. That night at dinner, Robb clapped Jon's shoulder and praised his performance. Jon smiled, though he glanced at Arlen in the background, sharing a moment of quiet pride. Ned watched the exchange, thoughtful, wondering if he should keep an even closer eye on them. But no suspicion marred the occasion. The North simply found it remarkable that Ned Stark's bastard had an uncanny talent for steel. Ned was relieved. Arthur felt content, seeing how Jon continued to grow. And so time meandered on, with only the occasional letter from King's Landing, or from the Vale, reminding them of a larger realm. Then, news arrived one day that Robert Baratheon planned a journey north. Word spread that he would visit Winterfell, accompanied by Queen Cersei Lannister and their children, along with a large retinue of courtiers and guards. In the Great Hall, Ned read the Raven's message aloud to Catelyn, Robb, and some of the household. Jon stood in the background, near a pillar, his eyes widening. He had never met the king before, though he knew he was the man who had overthrown the Targaryens. Catelyn looked concerned. "We must prepare suitable rooms, a great feast. Everything must be made ready." Ned nodded. "Aye. We have a month at least to prepare." His gaze flicked to Jon. For a heartbeat, he thought of the boy's real parentage, the Targaryen blood that Robert Baratheon so despised. Then he remembered Arthur Dayne, living incognito in the castle. If Robert or any of his party recognized him, it would be disastrous. That night, Ned sought Arthur in the quiet of a guardroom, away from prying ears. He found the knight polishing a worn helmet to keep up the ruse of a common guard. Arthur looked up, concern crossing his features. "Lord Stark," he greeted softly, rising to bow. Ned waved away the bow. "The king is coming. Robert Baratheon. He will be here within the month." Ned's face was tense. "You know what this means." Arthur frowned. "If he recognizes me." "He won't," Ned said quickly, though an undercurrent of worry made his voice unsteady. He didn't truly know your face. You mostly wore your helmet in battle and we were on opposite sides. He might have glimpsed you at Harrenhal's tourney years ago, but I doubt he studied your features enough to recall you decades later. Still, the risk remains. Arthur nodded gravely. I will keep to the shadows, or ensure that no rumor of my skill draws attention. I do not want to alarm the king. Ned exhaled. Very well. And Jon, we must ensure no one sees anything to suspect his true heritage. Robert can be blind in many ways, but he hates Targaryens with a fiery passion. If he suspected for even a moment that Jon was Rhaegar's son, he would... Ned couldn't finish the sentence. Arthur swallowed. We will protect him. In the days leading up to the king's arrival, Winterfell bustled like a kicked anthill. Servants scrubbed the castle walls. Fresh rushes were laid in every hall. The best wines were brought up from the cellars. Ned commanded that all guards be on their best behavior. He told Arlen to remain with the lesser guards, not to stand near the high table or draw the king's eye. At last, the royal party arrived amid fanfare and dust from the King's Road. Robert Baratheon, broad and boisterous, embraced Ned fiercely. The queen swept in with regal bearing, flanked by her twin brother Jaime, gold armor gleaming. Prince Joffrey, arrogant in his finery, followed with Princess Myrcella and Prince Tommen in tow. A host of knights and lords followed, among them the Hound, Sandor Clegane, and the imp, Tyrion Lannister. Banners flapped in the cold northern wind. Jon stood with the other Stark children near the courtyard, bowing politely as the king approached. Robert gave him a passing glance, just a bastard, uninteresting, and moved on. Jon felt a flicker of relief. Arlen, disguised among the lesser guards, kept his head down, carefully avoiding Jaime Lannister's golden gaze. The king wasted no time in demanding he see the crypts to pay his respects to Lyanna's tomb. Ned obliged, walking with Robert down those dark, echoing stairs. Torches flickered over the statues of Stark ancestors. Robert's voice was heavy with sentiment when he gazed on the likeness of Lyanna Stark. She was more beautiful than that, he muttered. You never told me she bore you, that child. Ned stiffened. He is mine, not hers. He was born of another woman. His voice brooked no argument. Robert frowned, but asked no more. Over the following days, feasts and hunts took place. Robert reveled in the North's hospitality. Wine flowed. The knights of the royal retinue tested themselves against Stark men in friendly bouts. Jaime Lannister displayed his skill on the training grounds, cutting down lesser challengers with a lazy confidence. The rumor reached Ned's ear that Ser Jaime, bored with easy victories, had asked if there was a man in Winterfell who could truly challenge him. Some said that if not for his vow of neutrality, Jaime might have demanded a duel with Ned himself. But Ned was too busy hosting to indulge. Meanwhile, an idle rumor floated that a certain guard, Arlen, might be a formidable opponent. Arthur Dayne heard that rumor and took pains to disappear whenever Jaime prowled the yard looking for challengers. Jon, on the other hand, found the presence of the Lannister guards and knights fascinating. He watched them spar with wide eyes, gleaning techniques and footwork. Arya stuck at his side, enthralled by the swirling capes and shining armor. One afternoon, they noticed Jaime Lannister exchanging blows with the Hound. It was a brutal match, steel striking steel in heavy rings that echoed across the yard. Nearby spectators cheered. The Hound's savage power clashed with Jaime's agile style. In the end, Jaime called it a draw. Arya exclaimed that she wished she could fight like that someday. Jon teased her that they'd have to find her plate armor for a sword that big. As the days turned into weeks, Robert and Ned spent time in the Solar discussing realm matters. Robert confided that he needed Ned in the south, to be his hand, to help him rule. Ned balked at the idea of leaving the north, leaving his wife and children, leaving Jon. Who would keep the secret safe if Ned was away in King's Landing? But Robert insisted, and the weight of old friendship and loyalty bore down on Ned. He told Robert he needed time to think. That evening, Ned paced the battlements, wrestling with the burden. He had no desire to immerse himself in the intrigues of King's Landing, especially with the Lannisters and other ambitious lords circling the throne like sharks. He worried about his children, about the North. Most of all, he worried about how to keep Jon's parentage hidden in the viper's nest of the capital. If Ned left, would Robert eventually call for Jon or suspect something amiss? Arthur Dayne approached quietly, head bowed in respect. "You called for me, Lord Stark?" Ned turned. He measured Arthur with a grim look. "Robert wants me to be his hand to go south. I suspect a trap or some hidden danger. The capital is no place for Jon, not with all the eyes that would be upon us. And if I leave him here, how can I protect him? How can I guarantee his secret remains safe?" Arthur's eyes flickered. "I could remain by his side, ensure no harm befalls him. If you trust me to safeguard him, that is." Ned nodded slowly. "I do, more than you know. But Jon will soon be a man. He will have questions we cannot answer easily. And if I am in King's Landing, I fear I will not be able to guide him as I should. The burden will fall on you more than ever, Arthur." Arthur lowered his gaze, acknowledging the trust. "I will not fail him." A cold wind rustled Ned's cloak. He glanced at the bright stars overhead, remembering the same stars that had glowed over the Tower of Joy. He said softly, "We are on a dangerous path, you and I. If we are discovered, both our heads will adorn spikes. But if that boy lives and grows into the man he is meant to be, we may yet have hope for a better future than any of us have known." Arthur Dayne followed Ned's gaze to the sky, and in the silent darkness, the sword of the morning recalled the night sky over Starfall, how the Danes always looked to the brightest star that fell. He remembered how the sword dawn was said to be forged from the heart of a fallen star, a symbol of hope. Perhaps in protecting Jon, he was preserving the last spark of something pure that Rhaegar and Lyanna had tried to create. A day later, Ned gave Robert his tentative acceptance, despite his misgivings. Preparations began for Ned to journey south with his daughters, leaving Robb as heir in Winterfell, accompanied by Catelyn, while Jon and the younger ones remained behind. Robert expressed disappointment that the bastard boy wouldn't be coming, but Ned cited the boy's lack of place at court. Robert shrugged, more interested in the feasts than some northern bastard. Jon learned he would be staying behind. He felt a pang of jealousy that his half-sisters got to see the capital, but he tried to hide it. Late one evening, he found his father in the Godswood, near the ancient weirwood tree. "Father," he began, hesitating. "Why do you not take me with you?" He tried to keep bitterness from his voice. Ned turned, face etched with sorrow. "Because King's Landing is no place for you, Jon. It's a pit of snakes. I would have you remain here where you're safe, where you can continue your training. You have a place in Winterfell." Jon looked at the red leaves of the weirwood. "I am not wanted by the lady of the castle," he said quietly, refusing to name Catelyn. "Safe, yes, but not welcomed." Ned's jaw tightened. He reached out, placing a hand on Jon's shoulder. "You are my blood, Jon, no matter what name you bear. That is enough. And Arlen will be here. He will see to your training. Take heart in that." Jon blinked. "Yes, father, as you command." A deep yearning flickered in Jon's eyes, but Ned could only stand helplessly. He could not reveal the truth. If only he could say, "You are my sister's son, the rightful prince of the realm, but I must keep you hidden." He could not. Instead, he pulled Jon into a brief embrace. Jon closed his eyes, a swirl of emotions inside him. When the day of departure arrived, wagons and horses lined the courtyard. Robert and his retinue, along with Ned, Sansa, and Arya, made ready to head south. Catelyn stood near Robb, both wearing composed expressions. Bran clung to Ned's leg, not wanting his father to leave. Arya hopped excitedly on one foot, a mixture of sadness and excitement shining in her gray eyes. Sansa dabbed at tears for leaving her home, but also looked forward to the wonders of the South. Jon stood off to the side, arms folded, trying to appear stoic. Arlen lingered behind him, a silent presence. Ghost prowled at Jon's heels, sniffing warily at the commotion. Ned exchanged final farewells with Robb, clasping his heir's shoulder. He turned to Jon, giving him one last searching look. "Grow strong," he said. "Be just, and keep your brothers safe." Jon nodded, voice thick. "Yes, father." Then, in a clatter of hooves and wheels, the royal procession departed. Winterfell's gates swung open, and the banners of House Baratheon and House Stark fluttered in the cold breeze. Jon watched them vanish into the distance, an ache in his chest. Beside him, Arlen remained quiet, aware of the boy's heartbreak and the tension that lay ahead. Now, more than ever, Jon would look to the mysterious cell's word for guidance. As the dust settled and Winterfell returned to its normal routines, Jon found solace in training. He immersed himself in swordsmanship drills. Arlen challenged him more each day, pushing him to refine his technique. Jon's quickness improved, his sense of timing sharpened. Robb occasionally joined their sessions, though he could not help but notice that Jon possessed a growing edge in skill. A fluid style that combined northern pragmatism with something more elegant, more reminiscent of the best knights. Meanwhile, life in King's Landing was fraught with intrigue, as letters from Ned hinted. Tensions with the Lannisters, the question of the true parentage of the Queen's children, the threat of a rising rebellion across the narrow sea. But none of that overshadowed the quiet drama at Winterfell, where a prince lived under the guise of a bastard, and the Sword of the Morning watched over him, a silent guardian cloaked in secrecy. Jon often felt a strange comfort in Arlen's presence. The man never belittled him for being a bastard, never withheld respect. Sometimes, when they sparred, Jon noticed flashes of genuine brilliance in Arlen's swordsmanship that almost seemed beyond mortal skill. Arlen usually suppressed it, quickly returning to the pace of a modest guard, but Jon's keen eyes caught glimpses. He began to suspect that Arlen was more than he claimed. Yet he said nothing, for he sensed that prying might end this precious mentorship. One crisp morning, just after the snows melted in the early spring, Jon and Arlen clashed in the courtyard with steel once more. Clang after clang echoed off the stone walls. Robb stood nearby, cheering them both on. Ghost lazed by the entrance, ears perked. Jon lunged, blade slicing the air. Arlen met his strike and forced him back. Sparks flew. They fought with a fierceness that made onlookers pause. At last, Arlen disarmed Jon with a swift twist of the wrist, sending Jon's sword spinning. Jon dropped to a knee, breathing hard. Laughter bubbled from Robb. "7 hells, Jon. You almost had him that time." Jon's chest heaved. "Next time," he gasped, a grin tugging at his lips. "I'll beat you next time, Arlen." Arlen gave a small nod, lips quirking. Perhaps so. He reached down to offer Jon a hand. As Jon gripped it, a strange flash of recognition flickered in his eyes, an echo of that moment years ago in the South, when Eddard Stark had taken Arthur Dayne's hand to save him. Only neither Jon nor Robb had any inkling of that distant memory. The onlookers returned to their tasks, oblivious to the living secret. On the battlements above, Catelyn Stark observed the scene with a pensive frown. She disliked the closeness between Jon and that cell's word, feeling an inexplicable unease. But she had no concrete reason to forbid it. Jon needed guidance, after all, and so, grudgingly, she tolerated it. Her heart remained uneasy, marred by the knowledge that this boy was a living symbol of her husband's infidelity. Thus life continued in Winterfell. Arthur Dayne remained at Jon Snow's side, teaching him lessons of honor and technique, guiding his steps on the path to manhood. Jon grew stronger, braver, forging friendships with Robb, Theon, and even the other Stark children. He became a fixture of the practice yard, forging a quiet respect among the guards for his dedication. Whenever doubt gnawed at him, whenever the question of his mother arose, Jon turned to Arlen, who offered calm reassurances without ever revealing the truth he carried in his chest. And so the seasons turned, and in the dark corners of the realm, rumors stirred of ancient powers awakening beyond the wall, and across the sea, a Targaryen girl plotted her return with Dothraki horse lords. But for now, in the north, a secret remained safe. A living Targaryen prince growing up with a direwolf by his side, shaped by the hidden guardianship of the last sword of the morning. In the hush of dawn, when Jon held a sword and met Arlen's patient eyes, the course of the future, far different from the realm's expectations, was being written in careful strokes of steel and honor. And in each moment, Ned Stark's mercy on the red stones of the Tower of Joy shaped a destiny that even the gods, old and new, had never foreseen. The sun crept over Winterfell's walls, bathing the courtyard in the early glimmer of dawn. Jon Snow stood with his sword in hand, breath steaming in the chill, eyes fixed on Arlen, who was, in truth, Arthur Dayne in disguise, circling opposite him. At the far edge of the yard, Robb Stark leaned against a post, offering the occasional shout of encouragement while Ghost lounged, silent and watchful, near the steps. The winter winds had abated a little, giving way to a crisp spring that sparkled in the puddles left by melting snow. Light danced along the whetstone. Arlen advanced, face calm, his sword lifted in a measured guard. Jon squared his shoulders and feinted low, only to transition into a quick thrust high. Arlen batted the strike aside with casual deftness. The ring of steel echoed in the still air. Jon adjusted, pressing the attack, feet sliding across the damp flagstones as he tried to find an opening. Nearby, a handful of guards chatted among themselves while occasionally glancing at the two sparring figures. They had seen Jon improve over the months. He was no longer just a determined boy with a decent swing. Now, he displayed a smoothness in his technique that belied his 14 years. Most attributed Jon's rapid skill to his diligence and Arlen's capable instruction. None guessed how extraordinary his teacher truly was. Jon breathed hard but pushed on, determined to land at least one telling blow. He aimed a cut toward Arlen's ribs. Arlen parried, the sword scraping with a bright clang. Then Arlen shifted seamlessly, hooking his foot behind Jon's ankle. A nudge, an unexpected pivot, and Jon's balance wavered. He flung his arms out, desperate not to sprawl face-first on the stone. But unlike earlier times, Jon recovered quickly, twisting his upper body to avoid the worst of the stumble. Though he half fell to one knee, he managed to keep his sword free. A grin, edged with frustration, flickered across his face. "I thought I had you," Jon panted. Arlen allowed the smallest smile. "You almost did." He lifted his sword, gesturing for Jon to stand. "But you telegraphed that shift in your weight. Next time, make it less obvious." Robb laughed from where he stood. "If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I'd think you were dancing. You're both too light on your feet for Northmen." Jon cast Robb a playful glare. "We can't all be as direct as you, brother." Arlen helped Jon regain his footing, the two exchanging a brief nod of mutual respect. None of the watching guards recognized, in that moment, how closely Jon's footwork mirrored a style rarely seen outside the finest sword courts in Dorne. Nor did they know that the unassuming sellsword, Arlen, had once been called the Sword of the Morning. As the morning sun climbed higher, the training session ended. Jon wiped sweat from his brow, chest heaving, and returned the practice sword to the rack along the courtyard wall. Robb gave his brother a hearty clap on the shoulder, praising him for his skill, and together they headed inside for breakfast. Arlen followed at a discreet distance. He never walked at the side of the Stark boys, seldom lingered in the Great Hall unless summoned. Ever since King Robert's visit and Lord Eddard's departure to serve as Hand of the King, Arlen had kept an even lower profile. Word reached Winterfell periodically. King Robert was straining under debts. The Lannisters now dominated the royal court, and Ned Stark navigated a dangerous web of intrigue. In Ned's absence, Catelyn Stark saw to Winterfell's day-to-day governance, with Robb increasingly assisting. Jon, always on the periphery, rarely joined them in the Great Solar. He spent more time with Arlen and the guards, though he dutifully attended some lessons with Maester Luwin. At a certain remove, Catelyn observed them, her misgivings about that quiet sellsword returning in waves. There was something about Arlen she could not place. Perhaps the silent intensity, the superb mastery of arms, felt out of place for a mere guard. Even so, her focus remained on household matters, and, when trouble stirred in the Riverlands, on the safety of her father's house. Her father, Hoster Tully, grew ill in Riverrun. Rumors of Lannister aggression began to swirl. She had many worries, and a spare glance for Jon and his mentor was all she usually afforded. Weeks stretched into months. The northern spring, though mild, was a season of preparation. The dire wolves grew larger, roving around the castle in playful packs. Ghost, for his part, remained silent and aloof. He shadowed Jon wherever he went, a spectral presence that unsettled some of the servants. Robb's wolf, Grey Wind, was more social, bounding around with a certain wild pride. Each child's wolf possessed a distinct character that seemed to mirror its dark companion. For Jon, Ghost was a symbol of his own identity. Alone, often overlooked, but intensely loyal. One day, Theon Greyjoy challenged Jon to a friendly archery contest in the courtyard. Theon had a cocky grin, swaggering with the confidence of a boy who considered himself near a man grown. Jon accepted, eager to prove himself. They fetched practice targets, setting them at the far end of the yard. Arlen stood behind, arms folded, while Robb and a few others watched. The first round of arrows flew. Theon hit the target near the center ring, a respectable shot. Jon's arrow followed, landing just inside Theon's mark. The onlookers let out a chorus of laughs and cheers. They took turns. Shot by shot, Theon's confidence waned. Jon's technique was calmer, more precise, perhaps inherited from the same hidden lineage that gave him an uncanny affinity for arms. In the final round, Jon loosed an arrow that struck dead center, quivering in the bullseye. A flush crept up Theon's neck as he loosed his own arrow in a hurry, missing the bullseye by a hand's breadth. A mocking cheer rose from the watchers. Theon scowled but forced a grin, slinging an arm around Jon's shoulders. "Well shot, Snow," Theon said, though bitterness lurked in his tone. "If I can't beat you, maybe I'll have to challenge Arlen next time. Let's see how our silent Sellsword fares." With a bow, Arlen, overhearing, gave the ghost of a smile. "I am not much of an archer. I prefer steel." Theon flashed that crooked grin. "Next time, let's see that too. I never see you fighting in the yard anymore, Arlen, and word says you're near as good as Ser Roderick. Perhaps I'll prove otherwise." Jon glanced between them, caught by a stab of worry. If Theon pressed Arlen too hard, if someone recognized the fluidity of the man's style, Jon feared the new king's men might start asking questions. But Theon was just being Theon. Cocky, restless, without real suspicion. Still, Arlen dipped his head politely. Another time, perhaps. The contests continued in small ways. Theon and Robb tested each other's swordsmanship, or they rode after boar in the Wolfswood, with Jon sometimes invited along. Their lives felt oddly suspended. The real storms, they knew, thundered in the south. Letters from Ned Stark to his wife and to Maester Luwin carried hints of tension in King's Landing. Robert's reeling treasury. The Lannisters' slow stranglehold on power. Rumors that the king's stepson. Many called him that in whispers, though publicly he was simply the prince, might not be the king's child at all. None of that seemed to matter in the quiet northern stronghold, though a faint tension pulled at the corners of every conversation. When next a raven arrived, it brought grim tidings. King Robert had been gravely injured in a hunting accident. Ned Stark, as Hand, was overseeing the realm until Robert either recovered or died. Within a day, another raven followed. Robert was dead. Joffrey Lannister, though still called Baratheon, had taken the throne, and Ned Stark had been accused of treason. Joffrey demanded the heads of traitors who refused to bend the knee. The news plunged Winterfell into a numb horror. Catelyn clutched the letter, eyes wide with shock and fear. Robb, not yet 6 and 10, stared at his mother. "We must call the banners," he said in a halting voice. "We can't let them kill father. They must not." Catelyn's hand trembled. "The Lannisters have him," she swallowed a sob. "They hold him in the Red Keep. They call him a traitor for challenging Joffrey's claim. They say he conspired with Stannis. They will execute him unless the North surrenders, or unless we do something." Robb's eyes hardened. "We won't surrender. Father would never want that. We call the banners, rally the North, and march south." Maester Luwin advised caution, but the tide in Winterfell was turning. The lords of the North, outraged at Ned's imprisonment, answered the summons. Messages flew to the Umbers, to the Boltons, to the Manderleys, to the Glovers. Armed men began to gather at Winterfell, their banners snapping in the wind. Robb, looking older by the day, wrestled with fear and responsibility. The boy who had been content to spar in the yard was suddenly thrust into the role of a commander preparing for war. Jon stood at the edges, uncertain of his place. Would he march with Robb, or remain behind as a bastard with no formal standing? His heart raged at the idea of his father imprisoned, threatened by men who cared nothing for honor. He wanted to fight. He wanted to do something. But when he approached the Great Hall, where Catelyn and Robb and the Northern Lords planned, Lady Stark's gaze fell on Jon with quiet unease. Jon felt that old sting of rejection tighten in his chest. That evening, he found Arlen in the old armory, where swords and armor had been laid out for inspection. The sellsword was checking the edges of a well-worn longsword that belonged to one of the guards. He cast a sidelong look at Jon's approach. Jon hovered, uncertainty etched in every line of his body. "They're calling the banners," Jon said, voice subdued. Arlen nodded. "Yes, war is coming, it seems." He paused, setting the sword aside. "What will you do?" Jon swallowed. I want to go with Robb. I want to fight for my father's freedom. He's the only father I have." Arlen met Jon's gaze. "And do you think Lady Stark will allow it?" Jon's jaw tightened. He shook his head. "She'd rather keep me out of sight, or leave me behind. She said nothing about me accompanying the host. She won't forbid me outright. Robb is the one calling the banners. But you know how it is. She'll protest that I have no place among the Lord's sons and sworn swords, that I'm not a true Stark." "Yet you are Eddard Stark's blood," Arlen said softly, as if recalling the words so often repeated by Ned. "And you have as much skill as any squire in the castle. Perhaps you should speak to Robb directly." Jon paced a few steps on the stone floor, frustration radiating through him. I'll try, but I can see it. They'll say I'm just a bastard, that I'm better off left behind to help defend Winterfell or do nothing." He bowed his head. "I hate feeling so powerless. My father might be executed, and I can do nothing." Arlen watched the boy's turmoil, empathy stirring behind his calm facade. He remembered the oath he'd sworn, not only to protect Jon's life but also to guide him. "The battlefield will be dangerous," Arlen said gently. "I understand your anger and your need to fight for your father, but war is no simple matter. Even if you joined Robb's army, you could be commanded to guard the baggage train or left in the rearguard. Or you might find yourself in the thick of slaughter, ill-prepared for the horrors you'll see." "I'm not afraid," Jon said quickly, though a tremor undercut his words. "I'd do anything to save my father." Arlen placed a hand on Jon's shoulder. "Sometimes the bravest thing is not riding off into battle. But if you truly wish to go, I will stand with you. I will vow to serve you as best I can, protect you as I have always tried to do. The choice is yours, Jon, but weigh it carefully." Jon's eyes burned. He recalled all the training sessions, all the unspoken kindnesses from this mysterious man. He did not question that Arlen would keep his word. Yet something about that unwavering loyalty made him uneasy, as if Arlen was far more than a simple guard. Jon pressed the thought aside, too troubled by the immediate threat to Lord Stark. "I'll speak to Robb," he said at last. "I can't just stay here." Late that night, Jon waited near Robb's solar until the Lords of the North had departed. Then he slipped inside. Robb stood by the fireplace, staring into the flames. The weight of command seemed to bow his shoulders. He turned when Jon entered, face taut. "Jon." Robb's tone was weary but warm. "What is it?" Jon took a breath, gathering courage. "I want to join you, Robb, when you march south. I know I'm just a snow. I know Lady Catelyn doesn't want me fighting alongside the Lords. But our father is a prisoner, and I can't stay idle while he's in chains." Robb's gaze softened. "You've as much right to hate the Lannisters as any of us. More than some even. But this isn't a game, Jon. We march to war. Men will die, and not even I know if we can save father through force of arms. Still, He paused, pressing his lips together. I want you with me. Always have. But mother, she'll object, Jon finished bitterly. I know, but the men, they'll follow your lead. If you say I'm to ride with your guard, that I'm to join the vanguard or at least be part of the march, then they'll accept it. She can't overrule you in this. You're the heir to Winterfell. Robb studied his brother's determined face. He saw the same stubborn set to Jon's jaw that Ned Stark often displayed. After a moment, he nodded. I suppose you're right. You'll come then. But listen to me. I don't want you herring off in some foolish heroics. Stick with your company. Fight only under orders. Promise me that. Jon let out a breath, relief flooding him. I promise. Then it's done, Robb said, though worry flickered in his blue-gray eyes. We ride soon. Gather what you need, see that your gear is in order. And Jon, watch your back. The Lannisters won't care that you're a bastard. They'll kill you just the same. Jon's heart pounded with a mingled fear and exhilaration. He thanked Robb, then hurried away to prepare. In the corridor, he nearly collided with Catelyn Stark, who was heading in the opposite direction. Her eyes flicked over him, uncertain. What are you doing here, Jon? She asked, voice cool. Jon dipped his head. I came to speak with Robb, my lady. And what business have you with him at this hour? A strained anger underpinned her tone. Fear for her husband, fear for her son, perhaps, but also that familiar resentment she harbored for Jon's presence in their family. Jon mustered composure. He has decided I will ride with the host. He did not back down, even as her expression darkened. She inhaled sharply, lips thinning. For an instant, Jon thought she might forbid it. But she had no direct authority to counter the future Lord of Winterfell's decision, and they both knew it. Her gaze drifted past Jon, as if searching for an argument, before settling back on him. Very well, she said, voice taut. But do not forget your place. You will not command men, you will not speak over your betters. Is that understood? Yes, my lady, Jon said, forcing as much courtesy as he could manage. She swept away, her skirts whispering over the stone, leaving Jon in the dim corridor. He exhaled. It was as good an outcome as he could expect. War came first. Personal resentments would have to wait. The next days blurred with activity. Squires and servants readied armor, provisions, mounts. Winterfell's smithy clanged day and night, forging arrowheads and fitting horseshoes. Lords and their retinues poured into the castle, swelling the courtyards with tents, armor, banners of the direwolf. They came from the White Knife, from the mountain valleys, from the frozen north near the last hearth. A vast host was taking shape, and at its head stood Robb Stark, anxious but determined, already wearing the mantle of leadership. Jon and Arlen prepared as well. Jon had a mail shirt that once belonged to some lesser cousin of the Starks, now fitted to him. He tested the straps on his shield, ensuring it would not slip in battle. Arlen quietly gathered his own gear, which was plain but well-made. Neither spoke much, but there was a solemn understanding between them. Ghost padded at Jon's side, sniffing around the bustling yard. The direwolf occasionally bared his teeth at strangers, eliciting startled yelps. Robb tried to speak words of comfort to his mother, but Catelyn could barely muster a smile. Her face was drawn with worry for Ned. The news from the south was uncertain. Some claimed Ned Stark would be forced to confess, then sent to the wall as punishment. Others believed Joffrey meant to kill him outright. As the host prepared to depart, a hush of dread lingered over Winterfell's walls. At last, the day came. Row upon row of northern soldiers filed out of the gates, heavy wagons rumbling behind. Spears bristled, horses whickered. Robb rode at the front with his most trusted companions. Theon Greyjoy, the great Jon Umber, the lords and knights who had pledged themselves. Jon Snow was assigned to ride with a detachment of young squires and lesser knights behind them, a place of moderate visibility but no real prominence. He felt a surge of pride just to be there, wearing the Stark colors on his shield, albeit a small one. Arlen, mounted on a sturdy courser, rode in the same column, stoic and vigilant. Catelyn watched them pass under the portcullis. Her eyes lingered on Robb, her firstborn, then flicked to Jon. A complicated swirl of emotions crossed her face. Resentment, sorrow, perhaps pity. She gave no farewell to Jon, only to Robb. Soon the banners of the direwolf stretched across the King's Road, forging south. The thunder of hooves and boots echoed in the crisp air. As the northern host moved beyond the lands of Winterfell, the reality of war sank in. Camps sprang up each evening, ringed by vigilant watchmen. Fires flickered against the looming darkness. Tension crackled through the ranks. Most were loyal men, but few had fought a full-scale war since Robert's rebellion. The older veterans remembered that war's harsh lessons. Supply lines, disease, how quickly fortunes could reverse in a pitched battle. Robb, though young, listened carefully to their counsel. Yet he also carried the boldness of youth, determined to save his father or die trying. Jon settled into a routine. By day, he rode among the squires, scouting occasionally at Robb's command, practicing with sword and bow in the evenings. By night, he often found Arlen at the edge of camp, quietly checking gear or scanning the horizon. Sometimes they exchanged only a few words, both aware that an entire war had ignited around them. Jon found an odd comfort in Arlen's steady presence. No matter how uncertain the world became, that vow of protection remained, unspoken but unbreakable. When they reached the twins, Walder Frey's demands slowed the host. Robb faced a difficult choice: how to cross the Green Fork. Ultimately, terms were made. Catelyn Stark herself arrived from a secret journey to broker the deal, ensuring passage in exchange for betrothals and hostages. The mood among the men soured as they witnessed the humiliating negotiations. Jon heard the lords grumble that Walder Frey was a weasel, but everyone realized they had no choice. The agreement was sealed. Jon was not part of those negotiations. He only saw the result. The Frey men joined the host, leading them across the Great Bridge. Word arrived from the south that Ned Stark's execution had been ordered. King Joffrey had demanded it in front of the crowd at the Great September of Baelor, unless Ned confessed and recognized Joffrey's legitimacy. Despair spread through the camp. Men looked to Robb, wondering if they would even reach the south in time. Robb's face went ashen when he heard. He made a new vow. If they could not save Ned, they would avenge him. The Great Jon roared agreement, brandishing his massive sword. Yet, the next raven carried a slender hope. Ned had confessed, naming himself a traitor, presumably to spare Sansa. The king's mood might be swayed. If negotiations went well, Ned might be sent to the wall. Robb seized on that shred of hope, pressing south with all haste. The host split into two forces, one led by Roose Bolton, the other by Robb himself, hoping to outmaneuver the Lannisters. The strategy was bold. Draw Tywin Lannister's main force in one direction, while Robb surprised Jaime Lannister's camp near Riverrun. Tensions ran high as they advanced. Blood would soon be spilled, and every soldier sensed it. Jon found himself riding among a small cavalry unit commanded by a young knight named Ser Martin Castle, a distant cousin of the Castles who served Winterfell. Arlen rode beside them, always near Jon, scanning the horizon for danger. Theon Greyjoy also joined this group, though Theon's place was closer to Robb. One morning, before they could break camp, outriders raced back with news. Jaime Lannister was encamped not far west of the Red Fork, preparing for battle. Robb assembled his men quickly, dividing them into flanking columns. The horn sounded. The Northerners advanced into the mists of dawn. Jon's heart hammered as he gripped his horse's reins, sweat slick on his palms. He had trained for years, but real battle loomed like a yawning chasm. Soldiers around him wore grim faces, some muttering prayers to the old gods or the Seven. Arlen adjusted his helm, leaving only his eyes visible. Through the slit, Jon could see an intensity that belied Arlen's quiet facade. His entire posture had shifted, reminiscent of some caged predator stepping onto the battlefield for the first time in many years. They crested a low ridge. Below lay a plain dotted with tents and hastily erected defenses, the Lannister encampment. A line of cavalry formed up on the far side, bright armor glinting with golden lions. The Lannister banners flapped in the faint breeze. Even from a distance, Jon could see the wealth displayed in their ranks. Plumes of crimson, polished plate, swords and spears gleaming in the morning light. The tension was broken by the shrill blast of war horns. The northern host let out a collective roar. Horses surged. The ground trembled under pounding hooves. Jon felt the shock of adrenaline as they hurtled toward the Lannister lines. Arrows whistled overhead. The Lannisters responded with disciplined volley fire, shafts darkening the sky for a heartbeat. Men screamed when the arrows found flesh, yet the Northmen pressed on. Jon ducked as an arrow zipped past, adrenaline screaming in his veins. With an impact that rattled his bones, Jon's horse collided into the chaos of men, armor, and blood. Swords flashed, spears thrust. Jon angled his shield, parrying a desperate lunge from a Lannister man-at-arms, then countered with a slash that cut into the man's shoulder. The soldier toppled, blood sprang. The smell of iron and sweat filled Jon's nostrils. Every breath was a gasp in a storm of violence. Screams, clangs of steel, the frantic neighing of horses. Battle was a chaotic maelstrom. Near Jon, Arlen fought with terrifying grace, cutting down foes who threatened their cluster of cavalry. He guided his mount with fluid precision, sword flickering from one target to the next. No wasted movements, no hesitation. More than one northern soldier, in the midst of the fray, stole a startled glance at him. But none had time to question how a supposed guard fought like a demon unleashed. The battle's fury demanded their all. Jon found himself face to face with a knight in gilded plate, the Lion of Lannister shining on his surcoat. The knight roared, swinging a heavy morning star. Jon barely managed to deflect it with his shield. The force vibrated through his arm. The knight swung again. Jon's horse sidestepped, nearly trampling a fallen man. The morning star whistled past Jon's head. Summoning courage, Jon struck. His blade caught the knight in the gap at the elbow. Blood spattered the gold plate. The knight shouted, dropping the morning star. Jon seized the chance, stabbing again. Then the swirling melee pulled them apart, horses jostling. He saw the knight reel, then vanish beneath surging bodies. Time lost all meaning. Jon couldn't say if the melee raged for minutes or an hour. He ducked arrows, slashed at men in lion-crested helms, felt a spike of dread whenever he saw a Stark banner waver. Here and there, the din parted enough for him to glimpse Robb's standard, the gray direwolf snapping in the wind. Across the field, the gold lion of Lannister seemed to falter, lines collapsing under the northern assault. Then came a clarion call from Robb's flank. Knights poured in from the side, smashing into the Lannister rearguard. Jon glimpsed Jaime Lannister's personal banner near the center, pinned down. The Lannisters were outmaneuvered. Cheers rose among the Northmen. The battle was tipping in their favor. As the enemy ranks broke, many began to flee. Shouts of victory and the clang of arms in pursuit filled the air. Jon reined in his horse, chest heaving. Sweat matted his hair, spattered with blood not his own. He saw bodies littering the field, some wearing the sigil of House Stark, others the Lion of House Lannister. His stomach lurched, but the living pressed onward, capturing stragglers and tending to the wounded. The tide had turned, and it bore the mark of a great northern victory. When the dust settled, the news spread. They had captured Jaime Lannister himself. Robb Stark had outsmarted the famed commander with a feint, luring Tywin's men away. Now, with the Kingslayer in hand, the Northmen held a powerful bargaining peace. The men roared with triumph, crying Robb's name. Many called him the Young Wolf, for the cunning he showed in leading them to victory. Jon found Robb in the aftermath, dismounting near a cluster of wounded men. Theon was nearby, helmet tucked under his arm, expression exultant. Robb looked exhausted but resolute, greeting Jon with a weary smile. "You're alive," Robb said, relief flooding his voice. "Thank the gods." Jon nodded, almost unable to speak. The carnage still echoed in his mind. "We have him? The Kingslayer." "Aye," Robb said. "He fought like a cornered beast but was overwhelmed. They're bringing him in chains now. Jon gazed across the battlefield, smoke drifting from burning tents. We've won a great victory. Does this mean... do we have enough leverage to save our father? Robb's face darkened. I pray so. We'll send terms to King's Landing. Jaime for father's freedom. They must accept. He's their precious Kingsguard, Tywin's heir. They wouldn't dare refuse. Jon hoped it was true. He looked around. Everywhere, men triaged the wounded, offered water to the dying. He caught a glimpse of Arlen, helmet removed, hair damp with sweat. The man bore only minor cuts, though his cloak was slashed in places. Their eyes met. Arlen gave Jon the barest nod of satisfaction, as though to say, "You survived. Good." Then he turned away, assisting a soldier pinned beneath a wounded horse. Word traveled fast throughout the realm. Robb Stark had defeated Jaime Lannister in open battle. The northern host freed Riverrun from siege, welcomed by the relieved Tully forces. Edmure Tully embraced his nephew Robb, praising him for his cunning. In the great hall of Riverrun, they celebrated the victory with sober pride. The Kingslayer sat in a makeshift cell, glowering and silent. Scouts reported that Tywin Lannister was regrouping further south, uncertain how to respond to the capture of his son. In the days that followed, Robb drafted careful letters to King's Landing, offering an exchange. Ned Stark for Jaime Lannister, Sansa Stark for Tysa Lannister, or whichever noble ladies might be under threat. Catelyn arrived soon after, tears in her eyes as she learned of Robb's triumph. She pressed him for details, insisting that Ned must be rescued at all costs. Through it all, she barely acknowledged Jon's role. She never asked how Jon fared in battle or whether he was wounded. But Jon expected no different. Arlen rarely left Jon's side, though no one noticed how he quietly shadowed the boy. In the chaos of post-battle negotiations, a variety of lords and knights came and went, each pressing Robb or Catelyn for favor, for position. Jon found these gatherings stifling, so he often remained outside, under the sky or by the river. Sometimes, after the bustle of the day, he and Arlen would walk the battlements of Riverrun, the cool night air carrying the smell of flowing water. They spoke little but found solace in each other's presence. At last, a raven arrived from the capital. Catelyn opened it in the solar with Robb and a handful of advisors. Jon lingered just outside the door, anxiety coiling in his stomach. Through the crack, he caught snippets of conversation. Words like refusal, traitor, and execution. A sob broke from Catelyn's lips. The hush that followed felt like a terrible omen. Moments later, Robb emerged, eyes red and furious. He saw Jon waiting there, swallowed, and said quietly, "Joffrey refused. He had father executed on the steps of the Great September of Baelor, before half the city. Sansa wrote the letter. She was forced to witness it." The words slammed into Jon like a hammer blow. He staggered back, breath caught in his throat. It felt impossible, unreal, that Lord Eddard Stark, his father, was gone. And all for the whims of a boy king in golden trappings, propped up by Lannister power. Robb's lips trembled in fury. In the solar, Catelyn wept softly, grief turning into cold determination. Jon's whole world reeled. Grief suffused him, tears burning at the corners of his eyes. He tasted copper in his mouth. Then a fiery rage flared, a near-blinding anger at Joffrey and all the Lannisters. Ned had done nothing but serve honor, always. The man Jon had loved, who had raised him from infancy, who had harbored him. Jon's knees went weak. Robb's voice was distant, cold. "They will pay. The Lannisters will pay in blood." Jon found no words. He clenched his fists, trembling, tears wet on his cheeks. A hand touched his shoulder. Arlen, face-stricken, trying to offer silent comfort. Jon turned, burying his grief behind clenched teeth. "Why would they do this?" he whispered. "He offered them everything. Because they are who they are," Arlen said quietly. "Cruelty is a weapon to them. The king's mercy is overshadowed by men who hold the real power." Jon recalled the last time he had seen Ned, the embrace near Winterfell's gate, the promise to be strong. And in a single, brutal moment it was all gone. The rest of that day was a blur. Jon wandered the corridors of Riverrun like a ghost, his grief threatening to consume him. He heard wailing from Catelyn's chamber, saw Robb receiving condolences from northern lords. Even Theon, usually so brash, wore a stunned expression. The next day, as dawn glimmered on the red and blue of Riverrun's walls, Robb assembled the lords in the great hall. Grief hung over everyone, but so did a seething anger. Great Jon Umber pounded his fist on the table, bellowing that they should declare Robb king in the north. Others joined the cry, rejecting the Iron Throne, forsaking all fealty to the boy king who had murdered Ned Stark. A thunderous roar of agreement rose among them. Catelyn looked on with shock, tears on her cheeks. She did not truly want more war, but after the blow they had suffered, vengeance and independence beckoned. One by one, the northern lords bent the knee to Robb Stark, calling him the king in the north, proclaiming the resurrection of an ancient kingdom. The river lords followed, to a lesser extent, out of ties to the Tully name and the mutual hatred of the Lannisters. Jon stood at the edge of the hall, heart pounding at the sight. Robb, tall, auburn hair gleaming in torchlight, unshed tears in his eyes, was crowned in the hearts of his people. Jon understood in that moment the North had broken away from the Iron Throne. This was no longer a war to free Ned. Ned was gone. This was now a war of vengeance and independence, a war that would drown the Seven Kingdoms in blood if left unchecked. In the midst of the uproar, Jon found himself thinking only of Ned's last instructions, the look in his father's eyes, the way Ned had always carried the burden of secrets. Father, he thought bitterly, I failed you. Then guilt rushed in. But no, he could not have changed Joffrey's cruelty. No one could. Still, the burden of that loss weighed on him like an anvil on his chest. Outside the great hall, Jon retreated to the Godswood. Riverrun's Godswood was smaller than Winterfell's, with a single weirwood by the water's edge. The trunk was smooth and white, the carved face solemn. Jon sank to his knees before the tree, tears slipping down his cheeks. Arlen stood nearby, silent. Finally, Jon spoke in a broken whisper. He was my father. I know I'm a Snow, I know I was never a true Stark. But I loved him all the same. Arlen came closer, kneeling beside the boy. His throat tightened at Jon's grief. He loved you, he said. He protected you with all he had. Jon nodded, sniffing back tears. I should have done more. If I'd been there, or if I'd ridden south from the start, or... He broke off, voice catching. Arlen's eyes shone with sympathy. He reached out, resting a hand on Jon's shoulder. None of us could have changed what happened. The seeds of this tragedy were planted long ago, in King's Landing, when power fell into the wrong hands. Ned Stark tried to do right, and for that, he was murdered by those who only care for themselves. Jon stared at the reflection of the white tree in the still water. I want justice, he whispered. I want Joffrey dead. All of them, all who had a hand in it. A pause, then Arlen's soft voice. Justice is a noble aim, but be wary of vengeance, Jon. It can burn through a man's heart until nothing is left. Jon gave a ragged exhale, burying his face in his hands. What else do I have now except vengeance? He pressed his palms against his eyes, seeing only the red behind them. Arlen glanced at the weirwood's carved face, remembering his own oath, made in another time to another man. Slowly, he said, You have a destiny beyond this, Jon. It won't feel like it now, not with your father gone. But I swear to you, by the old gods and the new, your life holds greater purpose than mere revenge. Jon lifted his gaze, baffled by the intensity in Arlen's expression. Why do you care so much? You're a Sel's word from the south. You owed father a debt. Yes, but you speak as though... He stopped, uncertain. Arlen's face closed off, as though he'd revealed too much. In that silence, Jon realized once again that there was more to Arlen than a simple guard's loyalty. But the question vanished beneath the roar of grief that battered Jon's soul. All he could do now was soldier on, following Robb. for Ned's memory, for the vengeance he craved. The war ground on. Tywin Lannister moved his forces, trying to bait Robb into open confrontation. Robb, newly named king in the north, advanced carefully, unleashing raids and ambushes, seldom giving Tywin the pitched battle he wanted. Meanwhile, the Starks kept Jaime Lannister prisoner, hoping eventually to trade him for Sansa and Arya, who were both captive in King's Landing. Letters from Sansa arrived sporadically, heartbreaking in their desperation. Of Arya they knew nothing. As for the Iron Throne, it refused to grant the North's independence. Jon fought in 2 more skirmishes near the Red Fork. Each time he proved his mettle, fighting with a ferocity that startled his foes. Arlen remained close, never letting Jon slip too far from his protective reach, though the boy hardly noticed in the heat of battle. Ghost, too, prowled the fringes, sometimes leaping into the fray to drag down a wounded Lannister soldier who threatened Jon's flank. Rumors spread of the bastard boy who fought like a demon, accompanied by a silent white direwolf. The men called him the White Wolf behind his back, half in respect, half in superstition. Yet in every lull, grief gnawed at Jon. Ned was gone. The realm had splintered, with new kings sprouting like weeds. Renly Baratheon proclaimed himself king in Highgarden. Stannis Baratheon pressed his claim from Dragonstone. And across the sea, word whispered of a Targaryen queen gathering strength with Dothraki hordes. Jon paid little mind to such rumors. His world was here, mired in the northern quest for vengeance. Catelyn Stark worried incessantly over Robb, urging him to seek a diplomatic solution to ransom Jaime for the girls. But the tide of war sometimes drowned out diplomacy. Tywin's armies threatened the Riverlands. Even as Robb negotiated, he had to prepare for more battles. Letters flew back and forth, alliances were tested. The Freys remained lukewarm, the Boltons cagey, each faction with its own designs. When winter arrived in earnest, fierce snows blanketed the Riverlands. Troop movements became arduous, supply lines precarious. Men froze to death on night sentries. In a stroke of cunning, Robb led a forced march, circumventing Tywin's scouts. Jon marched with him, cloak wrapped tight, Ghost at his side. Arlen scouted ahead, sometimes disappearing for a day or more, returning with vital information about Lannister patrols. Jon marveled at Arlen's ability to move unseen, a skill seemingly beyond that of a typical guard. Again, suspicion flickered, but he set it aside. Survival came first. They took the Lannisters by surprise near the Blue Fork, capturing a supply train. The spoils fed and warmed the northern host, sustaining them through the harsh cold. Afterward, they retreated to a more defensible position, awaiting the next move. This pattern of raid and retreat defined the war's second winter. Jaime Lannister remained a prisoner at Riverrun, growing increasingly bitter, occasionally taunting his jailers. Word reached them that King Joffrey was losing patience, that the city starved under the weight of war's disruption. The small folk of King's Landing cursed the Starks, the Lannisters, the Tyrells, everyone. The realm was caught in a swirling vortex of violence. Despite the bitter weather, Jon grew tall and lean. His skill with a blade became something the men admired. When he was not on the march, he drilled with Arlen or sat around the fires with the other young lords, listening to their boasts and fears. He rarely spoke much, haunted by Ned's death, consumed by a quiet determination to see the war to its end. Robb, for his part, strove to keep morale high, forging bonds of trust with his vassals. The men called him the Young Wolf, whispered that he was blessed by the old gods. Jon could see the strain in Robb's eyes, though. Being a king weighed heavily, every decision a labyrinth of alliances and enmities. Through it all, Arlen watched Jon with a mixture of pride and sadness. He saw the boy's fury, tempered now by the brutal lessons of war. There were times, in the hush of night, when Arlen longed to speak the truth, to tell Jon that he was not Ned's bastard but Lyanna's son, a Targaryen prince by blood. Yet the risk was too great. Robert Baratheon might be dead, but the realm's hatred of Targaryens burned on, especially among the Lannisters, who had every reason to fear a Targaryen resurgence. To reveal Jon's heritage now would only paint a target on his back, uniting all the great houses in seeing him dead, or else manipulating him for their own ends. The realm was too unstable, the war too savage, for such a revelation. Then came the day when a messenger arrived from King's Landing under a flag of truce. He bore a sealed letter from the Queen Regent, Cersei Lannister. She proposed negotiations for peace, offering an exchange. Sansa Stark and Arya Stark, if indeed Arya was found, in return for Jaime Lannister. Some mild concessions on territory might be possible. The letter was couched in flowery language, but the meaning was clear. King's Landing was struggling. Cersei wanted her brother returned, and she hoped to quell one front of the war to focus on the Baratheons. Or perhaps it was a trap. Catelyn pressed Robb to accept. "We must do this. For my daughters. For your sisters." Robb hesitated, conferring with his lords. Many urged caution. This could be a ruse to lure them into a vulnerable position. But the desire to free Sansa and hopefully Arya was strong. Jaime's captivity did them little good if they gained nothing in exchange. Tywin's main host was not crushed. The war could grind on for years. Eventually, Robb agreed to meet Lannister envoys at a neutral site under heavy guard. They would set terms. Jon watched from the sidelines, burning to see Sansa rescued, to know if Arya still lived. The negotiations would be delicate. Catelyn would lead them, assisted by a council of Robb's lords. Jaime Lannister would be brought to the meeting site, but heavily guarded, for the final exchange if an agreement was reached. Jon volunteered for the guard, but Robb declined, citing the need to maintain strict discipline. Sullen, Jon argued that he had proved himself in battle. Robb relented slightly, allowing Jon to come, but only if he stayed with a reserve contingent. "If anything goes wrong," Robb said, "we might need your group to intervene." Thus, a tense march began. 200 Northmen guarded Jaime Lannister, with Robb, Catelyn, the Great Jon, and others at the head. They arrived at the designated location, a broad meadow near a bend in the Trident, selected for its openness. Lannister outriders were visible on a distant rise. Careful signals were exchanged. Finally, on the next day, the Lannisters arrived, led not by Tywin, but by Tyrion Lannister, known as the Imp, along with a retinue of gold-cloaked guards. Word was, Tyrion had taken a key role in King's Landing's governance, overshadowing the child King Joffrey in practical matters. Jon waited with the reserve group behind a low ridge, out of sight. Arlen stood next to him, scanning the landscape. They could hear nothing of the negotiations except the occasional echo of raised voices. Tension crackled in the frosty air. An hour passed. Another. Jon's nerves frayed with every minute. Occasionally, a messenger would gallop over the ridge, speak hurriedly to the reserve commander, and ride away again. The men whispered in anxious tones about the rumored cunning of Tyrion Lannister. At last, as the sun dipped westward, a fresh messenger arrived. This one beckoned the guard forward. "The exchange is agreed," he declared. "We are to move Jaime Lannister to the clearing. The Lady Stark will receive her daughters. All is well." Cheers and relief spread through the men. Jon's heart soared. Sansa, Arya, could it truly be happening? The guard formed up. Jaime Lannister, manacled and flanked by halberdiers, was marched ahead. Jon marched with them, scanning the horizon for any sign of betrayal. Arlen walked at his side, hand near his sword. They crested the ridge and descended into the meadow. A ring of northern soldiers waited, along with a smaller circle of Lannister men. At the center stood Robb, Catelyn, and Tyrion Lannister with a handful of well-armed gold cloaks. The Great Jon loomed menacingly behind Robb. Jaime was led into the center. Jon spotted a girl there, Sansa, tears on her cheeks, stepping away from a gold cloak. She rushed into Catelyn's arms, weeping. Another figure hovered near her, though the girl's hood was drawn low. Possibly Arya. Relief flooded Jon's chest, mixing with caution. Would the Lannisters hold to their word? Tyrion said something that made Robb scowl, but the young king in the north nodded. The Great Jon signaled. The guards removed Jaime's manacles. Tension spiked. until Jaime simply rubbed his wrists, scowling, but did not attack. Then Tyrion gestured for the hooded girl to step forward. She pulled back the cowl, revealing a frightened, dark-haired girl with large gray eyes. She clung to Sansa's hand. That was indeed Arya Stark, alive, if a bit thinner and shaken. The sight brought a fierce surge of joy to Jon's chest. Both Stark girls returned at last. Catelyn all but collapsed with relief, clutching her daughters to her. Robb nodded to the Great Jon, who signaled the men to keep the ring but not provoke the Lannisters. Tyrion gave Jaime a pointed look. Jaime rubbed his temples, seeming frustrated, but said nothing. The tension began to ease. Jon dared to believe the worst might be over. Then, from the edge of the meadow, a thunder of hooves. Shouts of alarm echoed as armed riders burst into view. Men wearing a lion crest, but also some wearing the sigil of House Clegane. Led by the Hound, perhaps, or some other Lannister bannerman. They barreled toward the gathering in a violent charge, ignoring Tyrion's startled cry. Clearly, this was not part of the dwarfs' plan. Chaos erupted. Northern guards scrambled to form a shield wall. Gold cloaks near Tyrion brandished weapons, uncertain. Jaime Lannister, freed, seized the opportunity, knocking aside a guard and grabbing a sword from the ground. Catelyn screamed, shielding her daughters. Robb whirled, barking orders. Jon felt his blood turn to ice. He and his reserve rushed forward at a gallop. Archers loosed arrows at the charging riders. A swirl of steel and confusion erupted in the meadow's center. Tyrion roared at the intruders, but they seemed deaf to his commands. Jaime lunged for Robb, sword raised. The Great Jon intercepted him with a bellow, driving Jaime back. Lannister men poured in. Jon spurred his horse, crossing the meadow in a spray of mud. Arlen thundered beside him. He spotted Arya and Sansa, cowering behind their mother, as a mounted man swung a flail at them. The flail cracked the air inches from Catelyn's head. Jon's heart lurched. He yanked his reins, altering course. Arlen matched him. They barreled into the knight from behind. Jon's sword slashed across the man's back. The knight crumpled off his horse with a scream. Arya sobbed, clutching Sansa's arm. Ghost darted into the fray, snapping at the wounded man's face. Nearby, Jaime's steel clashed with the Greatjon's massive blade. The ring of metal was deafening. Jaime was a fearsome swordsman, though battered by captivity. Sparks sprayed with each collision. Elsewhere, Robb fought off two riders, his direwolf Grey Wind savaging a third. Tyrion, unarmored, frantically dodged flying hooves and clanged swords, shouting for the men to stand down. Chaos reigned. Jon dismounted, racing to guard the Stark women. He found Catelyn trembling but determined, ushering her daughters behind her. "Stay close," Jon commanded, voice tight. Another Lannister rider galloped too near, spear lowered. Jon deflected the thrust. The man swung around, almost trampling Arya. Jon braced for a second attack, but a flash of white and steel intervened. Arlen vaulted from his saddle and yanked the rider down, dispatching him with a single lethal stroke. It was too clean, too graceful, an echo of the sword of the morning that no one here would recognize in the heat of the moment. The knights under the lion banner, seeing the tide turn against them, began to break. Some retreated in confusion, others were cut down by furious Northmen. Grey Wind tore into fleeing horses, savage and unstoppable. A few gold cloaks tried to restore order, but it was too late. Tyrion was nearly bowled over by one of his own men. Jaime roared in anger, locked in a duel with the Great Jon, clearly outmatched in brute strength. The clang of steel ended when the Greatjon's blade caught Jaime's sword hand, nearly severing fingers. Jaime howled, dropping the blade. The Great Jon slammed him to the ground, pinning him with a boot on his chest. Silence fell, broken only by moans of the wounded. Blood soaked the meadow grass. The ragged survivors limped away. Tyrion Lannister tore off his cloak, tossing it aside in disgust. "Fools!" he spat at the retreating riders. "Idiots! Have they thrown away all sense for glory?" Robb yanked off his helm, hair plastered to his forehead. He glared at Tyrion, breath ragged. "Was this your plan, imp? A cunning trick to attack us once we let your brother go?" Tyrion's face contorted with genuine fury. "I had no part in this. It gains us nothing but more blood. Those men must have been acting on someone else's orders, Cersei, or perhaps some eager captain seeking the king's favor. I told them to stand down." He gestured wildly at his fallen brother, now battered in the dirt. Jaime glared up at Robb, hatred in his eyes, fingers dripping blood. Catelyn, still clutching her shaken daughters, fixed Tyrion with a murderous look. "You expect us to trust you now? My children were nearly slain. If not for Jon." She paused, refusing to say his name with warmth. "If not for the Northmen's quick action, they'd be dead. Was that part of your scheme?" Tyrion raised his hands in a placating gesture, chest heaving. "I would never." The entire negotiation was to return Sansa and Arya safely, exchange them for Jaime. "I gain nothing from this but more chaos." Robb's sword trembled in his grip. He stared at Sansa, tear-stained, and Arya, who was shaking with terror yet wearing that fierce Stark scowl. Slowly, Robb looked to the Great Jon. "Bind the Kingslayer again. This changes nothing. He remains our hostage." The Great Jon lifted his boot from Jaime's chest, hauling the Kingslayer up by the collar. Jaime's lip curled, teeth bared. The Great Jon slammed steel shackles onto the man's wrists, ignoring his injured hand. Jaime let out a savage curse. Tyrion pressed a palm to his forehead in dismay. In the aftermath, the meadow lay strewn with corpses. Lannisters, Northmen, horses. The planned exchange collapsed. Tensions skyrocketed once more. Tyrion was at a loss, insisting he had no knowledge or command of these rogue riders. Some of the northern lords demanded that Tyrion be seized as well. Robb refused, stating he had come under a flag of truce and was not personally responsible for the ambush. Still, distrust festered. Catelyn wanted the entire Lannister party to remain hostage until they discovered who had ordered the attack. Tyrion argued that he was the acting hand of the king and demanded safe passage back, or else Sansa could be declared a hostage again in King's Landing. They debated into the night, each side refusing to yield. In the end, Robb permitted Tyrion to depart with a token escort. Some gold cloaks, battered and humiliated, returned to the capital with their lord. Jaime remained a prisoner, now with an injured sword hand. Sansa and Arya, though deeply shaken, were safely returned to the Stark camp. Tears of relief mingled with fear for what might come next. Catelyn fussed over them, promising they would never be parted again. Jon hovered in the background, unsure how to greet his sisters after so much had changed. Sansa offered a timid nod, still frightened, remembering the sight of him spattered in blood. Arya, trembling with pent-up emotion, threw her arms around Jon the moment she saw him alone, face wet with tears. Jon held her, heart torn by the sorrow of everything they had lost. Within days, the host retreated from that ill-fated meadow to more defensible ground. The war raged on. The attempted exchange had failed, the hostilities reignited. Yet the Stark family was reunited, minus Ned, minus the hope of a peaceful resolution. Sansa remained quiet and polite, haunted by what she had witnessed in King's Landing. Arya seethed with anger, longing for revenge. Their presence gave Robb a renewed sense of duty, but also complicated matters. Protecting them became paramount, restricting how boldly he could move the army. Jon watched over his sisters as best he could. They still held more station than he did, so he kept his distance unless Arya or Sansa sought him out. Many nights, Arya joined him by the campfires, asking him to help her practice with a wooden sword, or simply to talk about Winterfell and the family they'd lost. Jon tried to comfort her, though part of him felt as lost as she did. Arlen remained near, quietly ensuring none harmed the Stark children, though no one recognized him as anything but a skilled guard. The months crawled by. Skirmishes flared. Men died. The northern host began to feel the strain. Supplies were short. Tywin Lannister, furious at the captivity of his son, poured resources into the war in the Riverlands, scorching villages that might aid the Northmen. Word came that Stannis was launching some campaign in the south, that Renly had been murdered under mysterious circumstances, that the Iron Islands might be stirring to rebellion. The realm was torn in too many directions. Eventually, winter's icy hand slackened, giving way to a reluctant spring. In that uneasy thaw, Robb declared his intent to return to the north with Sansa and Arya, to secure his home front and gather more forces if possible. He left some banners to hold Riverrun under the command of Edmure Tully. The decision was controversial. Some northern lords wanted to push deeper into Lannister territory, but Robb insisted on ensuring his sister's safety and regrouping. The battered northern army began a long, weary trek back north, towing Jaime Lannister behind them in chains. The war was not over, merely paused. Tywin's forces would not simply let the king in the north depart unharassed, but for the moment, both sides were too exhausted for a decisive battle. Jon rode near the middle of the column with Arlen, scanning for trouble on the horizon. Arya sometimes trotted up on a pony, asking him endless questions about fighting, about the war, about the next steps. Sansa mostly kept close to her mother's wheelhouse, seldom speaking. Robb led at the front, brooding over the North's future, over Ned's memory, over the uncertain destiny of an entire kingdom in rebellion. One night, as the host set camp by a small lake, Jon wandered away from the fires, needing space. The night sky spread overhead, the stars bright in the crisp air. Ghost padded beside him, steps silent as always. Jon's mind churned with memories. Ned's smile, the old days in Winterfell, the horrors he had witnessed in war. He felt unmoored, uncertain if he would ever find peace. Arlen approached, also quiet. They stood together by the water's edge. Jon glimpsed Arlen's face in the moonlight, the lines of guilt and sorrow etched there. A strange impulse gripped Jon. He turned, voice quivering with long-suppressed questions. "Who are you, really?" Arlen blinked, mask of calm wavering. "I'm your guard, Jon. I've told you. I owed your father a life debt." "No," Jon said sharply. "It's more than that. When we trained, you taught me things that no mere Sellsword would know. The way you fight, it's legendary. You speak of my father like you truly understood him. Yet I never saw you at Winterfell until after Robert's rebellion. He stopped, struggling for words. "I know you've been watching me my whole life. But why?" Arlen's expression flickered with raw conflict. For a moment he said nothing. Then his hand tightened at his side. "I swore an oath to protect you," he said softly. "Your father saved my life. He showed me mercy when all the world would have let me die. And I vowed to serve House Stark until I drew my last breath." "That's no answer," Jon pressed. "It doesn't explain how you fight like you've been trained by the Kingsguard, or how you speak like a knight of high birth. The men in the camp call you Arlen the Sellsword, but I can't ignore the signs. Did you serve House Dayne? House Martell? Were you a knight from Dorne?" Arlen's eyes flashed at the mention of House Dayne. For an instant, the moonlight revealed an ache in his gaze. Jon caught it, something deep and old. Slowly, Arlen exhaled. "I cannot speak of it," he said, voice taut with regret. "There are truths that would endanger you more than you realize. Please, Jon, trust me. When the time is right, and Gods be good if that time ever comes, I will answer your questions. But not now." Jon's lips parted, a swirl of frustration and curiosity roiling in his chest. He thought of Ned's quiet secrecy about his mother, the way no one would speak her name. He thought of all the pieces that refused to fit. "My father is dead," he said bitterly. "You're the only one left who might tell me the truth. If you know something, anything about my mother." Arlen's face contorted with grief. "I do, but I cannot speak it." "Why?" "Because I promised Lord Eddard." "Because your life depends on it?" Arlen said, voice trembling with old sorrow. "Jon, please, trust that Ned Stark did what he did for the greatest reason of all, love. Let that be enough for now." Jon clenched his fists, tears threatening again. "It's never enough," he whispered. "I'm sick of secrets. I've lost my father. I almost lost my sisters. My entire family is in peril. He broke off, wiping furious tears with the back of his hand. Ghost pressed closer, whining softly. Arlen reached out, gently resting a hand on Jon's shoulder. The old sorrow in his eyes remained. One day, he repeated, scarcely more than a breath. I swear it, but if I told you now, you would be in greater danger than ever. Let me keep my vow to your father. Let me guard you until the realm is ready to hear the truth. Something in Arlen's tone made Jon shiver. Slowly, he nodded, bitterness warring with exhaustion. Fine, he said, voice hollow. But if we ever see a day where this war ends, you will tell me. I will, Arlen promised, face set. May the gods grant us that day. They stood a moment longer, the gentle lap of water on the shore the only sound. In the moon's faint glow, Jon saw the quiet devastation etched in Arlen's face. A reflection of his own turmoil or something deeper. They parted with few words. Jon returned to the tents, curling up under his cloak, determined to chase away the questions that gave him no peace. The days bled into weeks, the war's violence fading behind them as the northern host pressed on. The weather turned kinder, soft breezes carrying the scent of pine and thawing earth. Sansa and Arya grew calmer, though nightmares still plagued them. Robb's thoughts were bent on returning to Winterfell, consolidating power, forging alliances that might break the Lannisters' hold. He hoped to gain the support of the northern mountain clans, to unify the region in defiance of the Iron Throne. Some rumored that Balon Greyjoy might rebel, but that was a threat for another day. At last, one brisk morning, the towers of Moat Cailin rose from the swamps, beckoning them north. A hush spread through the ranks. They were almost home, if war-weary travelers might still call Winterfell home. The men marched in subdued relief. Soon they would see their families, their fields. Healing might begin if the conflict allowed. Arlen guided Jon through the boggy terrain with sure steps, drawing on knowledge that belied his southern roots. The man had traveled these lands once before, on the painful journey that had begun Jon's life in Ned's care. They cleared the neck and pressed onward. A wave of emotion swept over everyone when Winterfell's gray walls finally came into sight. Robb, leading the vanguard, paused upon a hill to gaze at his ancestral seat. The watchers on the walls saw the banners, realized the king in the north had returned. Horns sounded. The gates swung open. Within the yard, a swirl of joyous reunion and sorrowful remembrance filled the air. Catelyn wept upon stepping back into the great courtyard, memories of Ned overwhelming her. Bran and Rickon, who had remained behind under the watch of Maester Luwin and Ser Roderick, came running out, faces alight with relief. They had feared for the worst after hearing the news of Ned's death. Now they clung to Robb, to Sansa, to Arya, tears mingling with laughter. They parted only to look at Jon Snow, who stood behind them, an awkward half-smile twisting his features. Bran and Rickon both embraced him, ghost-like with wonder, as if not quite believing their eyes. Jaime Lannister, still in chains, was dragged to a secure cell deep in the bowels of the castle, guarded by loyal men who'd not hesitate to kill him should he attempt escape. Many of those men had lost friends to Lannister swords, and they relished the chance to pay him back for every slight. Jaime's sneers and smug barbs did little to endear him. Robb maintained a stoic composure, determined to keep him alive for the leverage he provided. And so Winterfell once more bustled with activity, though overshadowed by tragedy. Ned's seat was empty. Robb bore the mantle of king in the north, albeit within his own walls. The family was not whole, Ned was lost, and so was the sense of innocence that once suffused these ancient stones. Jon, looking around the courtyard where he had grown up sparring with wooden swords, felt like a stranger in his own memories. He resumed a daily routine of training, seeing to the horses, and assisting in whatever tasks Robb set him. He spent time with Arya, who insisted on more sword lessons, real ones this time, not just the wooden stick. Sansa withdrew, spending hours with Catelyn and the younger brothers. Bran and Rickon followed her around, clinging to the sister they had feared dead. At meals in the Great Hall, A hush often fell when the conversation turned to war. Soldiers told stories of atrocities committed by both sides, and the reality of the realm's suffering weighed on them. Only occasionally did laughter break the tension, perhaps at Rickon's childish antics or Arya's sharp-tongued jibes. Arthur Dayne, Arlen, kept to his quiet post, seldom removing his helmet or venturing near the dais. At times, Jon caught him gazing at the Stark children with an odd, haunted expression. He wondered if the man felt guilt for not saving Ned or if he was simply mourning the realm's descent into chaos. Now and then, Jon recalled their conversation by the lake, the vow that one day the truth would be spoken. He wondered if that day would ever come. A fortnight after their return, Robb called a gathering in the Solar for his closest advisors. Jon was invited, a sign of trust. Ser Rodrik, Maester Luwin, Catelyn, Theon, and a handful of northern lords filled the chamber. The shutters were drawn, giving the room a dim, conspiratorial air. Robb began, voice quiet but firm. The war to avenge my father, our father, continues. The Lannisters have lost men, but so have we. Winter is uncertain. We can't commit to a long march south without risking our supply lines. Yet King's Landing remains in the hands of Joffrey and Cersei. Stannis battles them from Dragonstone, but who knows if he'll succeed. Catelyn added, we have to consider new alliances. The houses of the north are steadfast, but the war might last years if we stand alone. There's talk that the Tyrells have allied with King's Landing now. And the Greyjoys, she grimaced. Balon Greyjoy might try to carve out a kingdom for himself if we're distracted. Theon bristled at the mention of his father, but said nothing. Ser Rodrik stroked his whiskers. We might also look east. The Vale is quiet, but Lady Lisa Tully remains, reluctant to involve her knights. Perhaps if we appealed to her maternal instincts, your cousin. Catelyn shook her head. I've tried. Lisa has locked herself in the Eyrie. She wants no part of this war. She's afraid for her son. Robb let out a weary sigh. Then we have limited options. We must hold the north, consolidate, perhaps fortify Moat Cailin, keep a watch on the White Harbor approach. Wait for the Lannisters to overextend, or for Stannis to strike a blow. Meanwhile, I'll keep searching for an alliance that can turn the tide. Jon listened silently, only asking himself how any of this would bring real justice for Ned. He wanted direct action against Joffrey's throne, but the men around him counseled caution. The realm was in turmoil. Taking rash steps could doom them all. After the council dispersed, Jon remained, hesitating by the door. Robb noticed. Something on your mind, brother? Jon closed the door quietly, turning to face his half-brother, now his king. When do we strike, Robb? The Lannisters won't rest. They might send more armies or Harrenhal's men, or any number of mercenaries. Jaime is a hostage, but that didn't stop them from murdering father. Robb's expression softened. I know you want revenge, Jon. I do too, but we must be wise. If we march south blindly, we could lose everything. The north is strong, but it's vast and sparsely populated. If Tywin commits all his resources, we'll be outnumbered. Jon pressed his lips together, frustration evident. So we wait while more innocents die? While Joffrey grows bolder? Robb's shoulders sagged. I don't like it either, but we have to fortify, build alliances, maybe look for ways to undermine King's Landing from within. Tyrion Lannister might be more reasonable than Joffrey. Or perhaps Stannis. He's rightful heir by blood, they say. If he can topple Joffrey, maybe we can negotiate something. I don't know, Jon. I'm new to kingship. Jon sighed, nodding in reluctant agreement. He had no solutions, only anger. As he left, he found Arlen waiting in the corridor, eyes unreadable. Their gazes met. For a moment, Jon felt a flicker of that old sense of kinship, recalling all the times Arlen's counsel had steadied him. But this time, Jon's frustration roiled too hot. He walked past without a word. The weeks that followed were filled with a tense routine of winter readiness. The days turned shorter, a dusting of snow sometimes clinging to the courtyard. Robb dispatched riders to every corner of the north, calling men to fortify key strongholds. A small portion of the army remained at Winterfell, including many of the wounded. Jaime Lannister languished in the cells below. Sansa and Arya tried to reacquaint themselves with childhood routines, only to find them hollow without Ned's reassuring presence. Bran and Rickon clung to the older siblings, each coping in their own way. Jon trained daily, drilling not only with the sword but also with the men who guarded the castle, practicing advanced maneuvers with a few of Robb's seasoned knights. Arlen guided him, albeit more discreetly than before, mindful that prying eyes in the courtyard might notice. Now that war had sharpened Jon's skill, Arlen found himself needing to reveal a bit more of the advanced forms he once taught. He kept his stance subtle, never wanting to brandish the distinctive style of the Kingsguard. And yet, in unguarded moments, it shone through. Whenever they were alone in the old practice yard behind the broken tower, the illusions fell away. The fluid arcs of the blade that Arlen demonstrated were reminiscent of Dawn's brilliance, though the famed sword lay hidden, locked away in Winterfell's depths. One chilly afternoon, as they sparred behind that ruined tower, Jon unexpectedly broke through Arlen's guard, almost striking the older man's flank. Arlen turned aside the blade at the last instant, but a line of sweat glistened on his brow. Jon grinned, chest heaving. That was close. Arlen gave a short nod, impressed. You're improving still. If your father could see you now, He faltered, grief crossing his features. Jon's throat tightened. He'd probably tell me to watch my footwork, he said quietly. Arlen lowered his sword. He would. He'd also be proud. They stood in the fading light, swords in hand. In the hush, Jon dared a question, less heated than before. You said you knew my father well, that he saved your life. Was that at the end of the war? Arlen exhaled, glancing at the crumbling stones around them. Yes, he said simply. He chose to show mercy when another man might have chosen vengeance. Jon thought of Ned Stark's unwavering sense of honor, and of the hatred Robert Baratheon once bore for Targaryens and their loyalists. He was a rare man, Jon said softly, blinking stinging eyes. Arlen's voice turned hoarse. That he was. Then he cleared his throat, adjusting his grip on his blade. Again. Jon nodded, raising his sword. They continued, letting the ring of steel fill the silence. For a time, that was enough. No words, just the quick footfalls and the shifting patterns of an old dance, half taught by Ned's memory, half by a hidden legend from Dorne. Outside the training yard, the North braced for more conflict. Scouts brought news of small Lannister raiding parties near the Neck, possibly testing defenses. Pirates, some said Ironborn, harassed the northern coasts. Robb debated where best to send troops, how to protect White Harbor, how to hold Moat Cailin. Each day, new threats sprouted. Yet the winter wore on, and the king in the north strove to keep faith with his battered people. One night, a small feast was held in the Great Hall, more a modest gathering than a true banquet, aimed at lifting spirits. Meat and ale were served, minstrels played subdued tunes. Catelyn presided, with Robb on her right, Sansa and Arya next to them, then Bran and Rickon. Jon sat a bit farther down, next to Theon and a few knights. Despite the gloom of war, a flicker of warmth returned to Winterfell's ancient stones that evening. The direwolves sprawled by the hearth, the servants bustled with fresh bread and hot stew, the air thick with the scent of rosemary. Midway through the evening, Theon, slightly drunk, regaled the table with tales of the recent battles, laughing too loudly as he boasted of his archery. Some knights humored him, others rolled their eyes. Jon listened with polite disinterest, picking at a piece of bread. Occasionally, he glanced at Sansa, who sipped her watered wine, eyes distant. She hardly smiled. Arya sat with her chin in her hand, bored by the talk of war. Suddenly, Theon turned to Jon with a teasing grin. And here's Snow, the demon swordsman with his ghostly wolf. Tell me, friend, how did you learn to fight like that? I still say it was some southern mother gave you your quick feet. That's the rumor. Jon felt a prick of annoyance, but forced a shrug. I just trained with whoever would teach me. Whoever would teach you, indeed, Theon said, eyes flicking to Arlen at the far end of the hall. You and that quiet shadow of yours. Robb cut in sharply. Enough, Theon. We all bled together in the war. Jon earned his place. Theon raised his hands mockingly. Just praising him, my liege. But the truth remains. Jon here can fight like a water dancer from Bravos if he chooses. Maybe that's where he got his mother, across the narrow sea. He laughed at his own jest. Jon stiffened, anger flaring. But he could see Catelyn's disapproving gaze, and he forced himself to remain calm. Perhaps that's so, he said curtly, and perhaps it's none of your business. Before Theon could retort, Arlen, who had been standing guard near the hall's entrance, stepped forward to speak quietly with one of the serving men. Something about his presence radiated quiet menace, as though he could sense Jon's discomfort. Theon eyed him, a slight shiver crossing his face, then turned back to his mug. Robb cast Jon an apologetic look, then attempted to steer the conversation to safer topics. The feast meandered on. Eventually, the music grew softer, and families with children began slipping out. The night's gloom wrapped around Winterfell once more. In the corridor outside, Jon paused to gather his composure, still fuming at Theon's jibes. Then he heard a small voice call his name. He turned to see Arya peering around the corner. She beckoned him closer. In the dim torchlight, her face looked both young and haunted. "Jon," she whispered, "did you ever find out about your mother? Father promised to tell you next time we spoke. But then, everything happened. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked." Jon's chest constricted. He forced a wry smile. "No, I never did. Father kept that secret to the end." Arya's eyes shone with sympathy. "I'm sorry," she repeated. "I know what it's like to not have answers. Everything's changed, and I barely recognize home. I miss Father." Jon nodded, unable to trust his voice. He patted her shoulder gently. "We'll carry on, Arya. He'd want us to be strong. You've got your sword, right?" She lifted her chin. "Needle. I still have it. I won't ever let them take it from me." He tried to smile. "Good." He ruffled her dark hair. "Go on to bed, then. You'll need your rest if you're going to keep up your lessons with me tomorrow." With a small grin, she scampered off. Jon stood there a moment longer, thinking how alone Arya must feel. How alone all the Starks felt, really. But at least they had each other. Jon felt a pang. He too was a Stark in part, yet always on the outside. The secrets swirling around his birth weighed heavier than ever. As the quiet hours of night deepened, Winterfell's torches were extinguished one by one. Snow drifted softly from the sky, blanketing the old stone in a hush. In a small chamber near the armory, Arthur Dayne sat on a crude stool, removing his worn boots. He flexed his toes, wincing at an ache in his side. The old wound from the Tower of Joy sometimes pained him in the cold. By the light of a single candle, he looked upon his simple pallet, the trunk of gear he seldom opened, the closed door that separated him from the sleeping castle. He listened to the wind moan through the cracks, and for a moment, he remembered the warm breezes of Dorne, the shimmer of Starfall's waterfalls. Memories of his sister Ashera, of the Golden Prince Rhaegar, of Lyanna Stark. All ghosts of a past life. He placed a hand on his chest, feeling his heart's steady thump. He recalled Ned Stark's mercy that day, the day he should have died. Now Ned himself was gone, murdered by the very Iron Throne he had once served. And Jon, that child of two worlds, was left adrift in a realm drowning in blood. Arthur clenched his jaw. The vow he had made, to protect Jon, see him live, see him fulfill whatever destiny ran in his veins. So long as Arthur Dayne drew breath, that vow would hold, no matter the cost. He whispered a silent prayer to the old gods and the seven alike. Let me not fail. Let me guide him rightly. Let me keep him safe. He doused the candle and lay down, steeling himself for another night of half-sleep, always listening for footsteps, for trouble. The war was not done. The realm was not at peace. But for tonight, at least, Jon slept under the same roof. The young man had grown strong, able to weather storms. The future might hold trials fiercer than any sword or army. But so long as Arthur Dayne lived, Jon Targaryen Stark, though he knew not that name, would not face them alone. And in the darkness, as snow blanketed Winterfell, the winds of fate swirled. The legacy of Rhaegar's last son survived in the north, guarded by the final night of a fallen star. The realm's tragedies might burn on, but a quiet seed of hope remained, hidden in the fortress of the wolves, waiting for the hour when secrets would come to light and the rightful heir would stand revealed. Until then, Jon Snow walked a path of shadow and promise, led by the silent guardian who owed his life to mercy at the Tower of Joy.